Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I worked the graveyard shift at Rusty's Junction truck stop for 8 months in 2019, and I can tell you right now, there are things that happen in the dead of night at these places that'll make your skin crawl and haunt your dreams for years to come. What I experienced during those 8 months changed everything I thought I knew about reality, about the nature of travel, and about the thin boundaries between our world and whatever lies beyond it. Rusty's sits right off exit 127 on Interstate 25 in northern New Mexico, about 40 miles south of the Colorado border, nestled in a stretch of high desert that most folks just drive through without giving it a second thought. It's one of those old-school truck stops that's been there since the early 70s, with faded turquoise paint peeling off the concrete block walls and fluorescent lights that flicker just enough to make you think something's moving in the shadows when there ain't nothing there. The building itself is shaped like an L, with the convenience store and 24-hour diner forming the main section that faces the interstate, and the shower facilities and laundry stretching out toward the back of the property like an afterthought. There's 43 numbered parking spaces for big rigs, most of them unpaved gravel with a few newer paved spots near the fuel islands that were added sometime in the 90s, when the original owner tried to modernize the place. During the day, especially during tourist season when families are driving cross-country to see the Grand Canyon or visit relatives in California, it's busy enough. Steady stream of long-haul drivers coming through, families on road trips stocking up on snacks and gas. The occasional caravan of RVs heading to or from camping spots in the Rocky Mountains. You get your regular customers, your one-time visitors, your lost tourists who took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up 50 miles off their intended route. But after midnight, especially during the week when most sensible people are home in bed, it gets real quiet, real fast. The kind of quiet that makes every little sound seem amplified, every shadow seem deeper, every movement in your peripheral vision seem like it might be something more than just tricks of tired eyes. The kind of quiet that makes you understand why our ancestors were afraid of the dark. My supervisor was this old-timer named Clyde Thornton, who'd been working truck stops and gas stations since before I was born. Clyde was pushing 70, but still had the energy and alertness of a man half his age, probably because he'd spent his whole adult life on the night shift and had adjusted his internal clock permanently to nocturnal hours. He was the kind of guy who knew every regular driver by name and route, could spot trouble from a mile away just by the way someone walked through the door, and had more stories about weird customers and strange incidents than anyone had a right to accumulate in one lifetime. He was also the kind of guy who'd seen enough over the decades to know that there were things in this world that couldn't be explained by logic or science, things that operated according to rules older than human civilization. He never talked about it directly, but sometimes when we were working together during my training period, he'd make comments that suggested he'd encountered his share of unexplainable phenomena over the years. Truck stops are strange places, he told me once during a quiet afternoon shift. They're crossroads, you know, not just for highways, but for other things. People traveling between one place and another. But sometimes those places aren't on any map you've ever seen. At the time, I thought he was just being philosophical, maybe a little eccentric in the way that people who work alone for long periods sometimes become. I had no idea how literally accurate his words would turn out to be. He trained me for 2 weeks on the day shift before throwing me into the deep end with the overnight hours, and I thought I was ready for anything. I'd worked retail before, dealt with difficult customers, handled money and inventory and all the basic responsibilities of running a convenience store. How hard could it be to do the same thing at night? "Listen here, Opal," he told me on my last training day. sitting across from me in one of the cracked vinyl booths in the diner section while the afternoon shift change was happening around us. The night shift is different from anything you've done before. You get drivers who've been awake for 20 hours straight and are seeing things that aren't there. You get people running from things they don't want to talk about, using cash only and looking over their shoulders every few minutes. You get folks who they just ain't quite right in the head, if you know what I mean. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully, looking out the big windows at the truck parking area where a few early evening arrivals were settling in for their mandatory rest periods. The sun was setting behind the mountains to the west, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if not for the ominous feeling that seemed to hang over the place like a fog. "Most of them are harmless," he continued. "Truckers are good people by and large. They work hard, they're away from their families for weeks at a time, and they look out for each other on the road. It's the others you gotta watch out for. The ones who don't quite fit the pattern, who seem like they're playing a role instead of just being themselves. You keep your wits about you, trust your gut, and if something feels off, and I mean really off, not just weird customer off, you call me or you call the county sheriff. Don't try to be a hero." He paused and looked at me directly, his weathered face serious in a way I'd never seen before. "And Opal, if you start seeing things that don't make sense, things that seem impossible, don't assume you're losing your mind. This place has history, old history. Sometimes that history bleeds through into the present." I thought he was just being overly dramatic, the way older folks sometimes get when they're trying to scare younger people into being careful. I figured I'd encountered my share of strange customers in previous jobs, and I could handle whatever the night shift might throw at me. I had no idea what I was walking into. My first month went by without much incident that seemed genuinely threatening or supernatural. You get your share of peculiar customers during the overnight hours. Drivers talking to themselves or to invisible passengers, people buying bizarre combinations of items like rope and candy and motor oil all together, the occasional drunk trying to buy more alcohol after we'd legally stopped selling it, tourists who'd gotten lost and ended up 50 miles off their intended route with no idea how they'd gotten there, but nothing that really set off serious alarm bells or made me question my sanity. The loneliest part was the stretch between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., when the overnight drivers had mostly found their parking spots for mandatory rest breaks, and the early morning crowd hadn't started moving yet. During those hours, I'd sometimes go 2 full hours without seeing another human being, just me and the humming refrigeration units and the endless expanse of high desert visible through the big front windows. The building made all kinds of noises during those quiet hours that I had to learn to identify and ignore. The refrigeration units for the beer coolers and frozen food would kick on and off with different mechanical sounds, some humming, some clicking, some making a grinding noise that always made me worry something was about to break down. The ice machine would periodically drop a full load with a crash that'd make you jump if you weren't expecting it, especially when you were deep in concentration counting money or doing inventory. The old heating system was the worst offender during the winter months, clanking and wheezing and making sounds like it was trying to die a slow, painful death throughout the night. There were pipes running through the walls that would expand and contract with temperature changes, creating random banging sounds that could come from any direction without warning, always when you least expected them. The fluorescent lights in the back hallway near the showers buzzed constantly with that particular frequency that gets under your skin after a while, and one of them had this habit of flickering just fast enough to catch your peripheral vision and make you think someone was moving back there. I must have walked back to check that hallway 50 times during my first month, always expecting to find someone lurking around who shouldn't be there, but it was always just that one defective light fixture playing tricks on my eyes. It was during my second month that I started noticing patterns in some of our regular customers that didn't quite add up when I thought about them carefully. There was this one driver who came through every Tuesday night around 3 a.m. like clockwork. Always bought the exact same things: 2 Monster energy drinks, a bag of beef jerky, and a 4-pack of AA batteries. Nothing particularly weird about that combination, except he always paid with exact change counted out to the penny, never said a word beyond "thank you" and "have a good night," and his truck was always parked in space 37, even when spaces much closer to the building were available. I started calling him Tuesday Batteries in my head, because I never got his real name despite seeing him weekly for months. He was maybe 50 years old, average height and build, always wearing the same faded blue work shirt that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times. His appearance was neat and clean, nothing obviously off about his hygiene or mental state, but there was something about his demeanor that bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. What bothered me wasn't what he did, but what he didn't do. Most drivers, especially the regulars who'd been stopping at the same places for years, they chat a little bit. Ask about the weather, mention where they're headed or where they came from, complain about traffic or construction delays or dispatchers who don't understand road conditions. They're social creatures by necessity, spending most of their time alone in a truck cab, so they tend to take advantage of human interaction when it's available. Tuesday Batteries never engaged in any of that normal social behavior. He'd walk in, grab his items with mechanical precision, pay without making eye contact, and walk out. He had this way of looking at you when you were ringing up his purchase that made you feel like he was memorizing your face, studying your features with an intensity that was just a little too focused to be casual observation. The third time he came in, I decided to try striking up a conversation. "Busy night out there?" I asked while scanning the barcode on his energy drinks. He looked at me for a long moment with these pale gray eyes that didn't seem to blink often enough, like he had to consciously remind himself to do it. "Always busy," he said, but his voice was flat and emotionless, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't understand. "Where are you headed tonight?" I tried again, hoping to get some kind of normal response that would put me at ease. "West," he said, still with that same flat tone. He took his change without checking it, nodded once with mechanical precision, and walked out. I watched through the big front windows as he got into his truck, a white Peterbilt with no company markings or identifying information visible, and pulled out of space 37. The weird part was, he turned east onto the interstate, not west like he'd said. That might seem like a small thing, but when you work nights at a truck stop, you start paying attention to details like that because details are what keep you safe. Drivers lie about where they're going for all kinds of reasons. Some legitimate, like not wanting to reveal valuable cargo routes to potential thieves, some not so legitimate. But something about the way Tuesday Batteries had lied bothered me in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't the kind of casual misdirection that cautious drivers might use for security reasons. It felt more deliberate, more scripted. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to other regular customers, looking for similar patterns or behaviors that didn't quite fit what I'd expect from normal truck stop clientele. There was an older woman who came in every other Friday around 4 a.m., always bought a large coffee and a pack of cigarettes, always wore the same brown leather jacket regardless of weather conditions. She paid cash, never spoke beyond the basic transaction requirements, and drove a sedan with Nevada plates that was always parked in the same spot near the dumpster area. What struck me as odd about her was that she never actually seemed to smoke the cigarettes. I'd watch her through the windows, and she'd sit in her car for maybe 10 minutes after buying them, but I never saw her light one up. She'd just sit there, motionless, staring toward the truck parking area like she was watching for something specific. Then there was a trucker who showed up irregularly, maybe once every 3 weeks, always during the dead period between 2 and 4 a.m. Big guy, probably in his 50s, driving a blue Kenworth with Oklahoma plates. He'd come in, buy a sandwich from the deli case and a cup of coffee, and always ask the same question. "You seen anything unusual lately?" The first few times he asked, I assumed he was making conversation about weird customers or maybe asking about accidents or road conditions. But when I'd try to answer with stories about odd purchases or drunk customers, he'd get this disappointed look and say, "No, not that kind of unusual, the other kind." When I'd ask what he meant by the other kind, he'd just shake his head and say, "You'll know it when you see it. Hopefully you won't." These interactions left me feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was like there was some kind of ongoing situation or phenomenon that regular customers were aware of, but nobody wanted to talk about directly. Like they were all part of some unspoken understanding about the nature of our location that I wasn't privy to as a newcomer. The real strangeness started in my third month around Halloween. The date was October 30th, and I was working what should have been a routine Tuesday night shift when this family came in around 1:30 a.m. Mom, Dad, and 2 kids who looked like they were maybe 8 and 10 years old. They were driving a dark blue minivan with Arizona plates, and the moment they pulled up to the fuel pumps, something about them set off every alarm bell I had. The dad came in first while the rest of the family waited in the van, and he immediately struck me as wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. He was tall and thin, with dark hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in several days, and his clothes were rumpled like he'd been sleeping in them for an extended period. But it wasn't just his appearance, it was his behavior. He had this nervous energy that made him keep looking over his shoulder toward the parking lot, like he was expecting someone to follow him inside. "Can I help you?" I asked from behind the counter, trying to keep my voice professional despite the unease I was feeling. "We need gas," he said, but then he just stood there staring at me instead of going to the pump or telling me how much he wanted to purchase. "What pump number?" I prompted. "Oh, 7, I think." He pulled out a credit card with hands that were shaking slightly, but not from cold. The night was warm for late October. While I was processing the payment, I could see the van through the front windows, and what I observed made my skin crawl. The woman in the passenger seat never moved, not once during the entire 10 minutes they were there. She just sat there staring straight ahead with an unnaturally rigid posture, like she was frozen in place or unconscious with her eyes open. The 2 kids in the back seat were pressing their faces against the windows, but not in the way kids usually do when they're excited or curious about new surroundings. They looked scared, genuinely terrified. Their faces were pale, their eyes were wide, and they kept looking back and forth between the store and something outside the van that I couldn't see from my angle. "You folks traveling far?" I asked, because something about the whole situation was making me nervous, and I wanted to keep the father talking while I tried to figure out what was wrong with this picture. "Just passing through," he said quickly, too quickly. "Long drive. Kids are tired." But when I looked at the kids again, they didn't look tired. They looked like they were in some kind of distress, like they wanted to call for help but were afraid to. The woman still hadn't moved so much as a muscle. The man finished paying and started to leave, then turned back with what seemed like forced casualness. "Is there anywhere around here that's quiet? Where we could park for a few hours without being bothered?" Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to give him that information, but I didn't have a good reason to refuse a reasonable request from a paying customer. "The truck parking in back is pretty quiet after 2 a.m., I told him, immediately regretting it. He nodded and left without another word. I watched as he got back into the van and appeared to say something to the woman. She still didn't move, didn't react, didn't even turn her head to acknowledge that he was speaking. The van pulled around to the back parking area where I couldn't see it anymore from my position behind the counter. For the next 20 minutes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening in that van. The father's nervous behavior, the woman's complete immobility, the obvious fear in the children's faces. None of it added up to a normal family road trip scenario. I found myself checking the clock obsessively, wondering if I should call the sheriff's department, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting to what might be a perfectly innocent situation. Then I heard the shouting. It was faint because of the distance and the building's walls, but I could tell it was a man's voice, and he sounded angry. Really angry. Not the kind of tired frustration you might expect from a father dealing with cranky kids on a long drive, but genuine rage. The kind of voice that makes your blood run cold, even when you can't understand the words. I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable, violent, threatening, full of barely controlled fury. Then I heard what might have been a child crying, high-pitched and desperate, the kind of sound that cuts right through you and activates every protective instinct you have. I should have called the sheriff right then. That's exactly what Clyde had told me to do if something felt wrong. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that families argue when they're tired and stressed from long drives, that it wasn't my business to interfere in domestic disputes unless someone was in immediate physical danger that I could prove. The shouting continued for several minutes, getting louder and more intense, before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow more disturbing than the yelling had been. Complete, oppressive silence from the direction of the back parking area. At 3:15 a.m., Tuesday Batteries came in for his usual purchase. Same routine, same items, same mechanical precision. But when he was leaving, he paused at the door in a way that was completely out of character for his normal behavior pattern. "That family in the van," he said without turning around to look at me. "They been there long?" "About an hour and a half," I said, surprised that he'd spoken up about anything other than his transaction. He nodded slowly, like he was processing this information. "Might want to check on them." Then he left, got in his truck, and drove away. Again, he turned east instead of the west direction he always claimed to be heading. I waited another 15 minutes, telling myself I was just being cautious and professional, before I worked up the nerve to walk back to the parking area to check on the family. The van was still there, parked in the far corner where the overhead security lights didn't reach very well and the shadows were deep enough to obscure details. All the windows were fogged up from the inside, condensation thick enough that I couldn't see anything of the interior. The van was completely silent. No sounds of conversation, no sounds of movement, no sounds of life at all. I walked closer, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the gravel. When I got about 10 feet away, I called out, "Excuse me, is everything okay over there?" No answer. The van remained silent as a tomb. I took a few more steps and knocked on the driver's side window. "Sir? Ma'am? Is everyone all right in there?" Still nothing. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural. No sounds of breathing, no small movements that you'd expect from people sleeping in a vehicle, no response to my presence at all. I tried the door handle, though I knew I probably shouldn't be doing it. It was unlocked. When I opened the door, the overhead light came on automatically, illuminating the interior. The van was empty, completely, impossibly empty. No people, no luggage, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had ever been inside except for a lingering smell, something sweet and unpleasant that I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach turn. The seats looked like they'd never been sat in. The floor mats were clean. There was no trash or evidence of human occupancy anywhere. I stood there for probably a full minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. 4 people had gotten into this van less than 2 hours ago. I'd watched them drive back here. I'd heard them arguing, heard what sounded like someone crying. And now they were just gone. I looked around the parking area, thinking maybe they'd gotten out and walked somewhere, but there was literally nowhere to go. We were surrounded by high desert on 3 sides and the interstate on the 4th. The nearest building was another truck stop 12 miles down the road. The nearest town was 25 miles in either direction. Where could 4 people, including 2 young children, have gone on foot in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere? I went back inside and called Clyde, even though it was almost 4 a.m. and I knew he'd be asleep. "What's wrong?" he answered on the second ring, instantly alert in the way that people who've worked emergency services develop over time. I told him about the family, about the suspicious behavior, about the shouting I'd heard, about checking the van and finding it empty. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him thinking. "You sure it was the same van?" he asked. "Arizona plates, dark blue minivan, same one." "And you're sure they didn't just walk off somewhere?" "Clyde, there's nowhere to walk to. And why would they leave their van unlocked with the keys in it?" Another pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't go back outside until I get there." While I waited for Clyde, I kept looking out the back window at the van. It was still there. Driver's door still open, interior light still on, looking exactly like what it was. An abandoned vehicle that someone had left in a hurry. But the more I stared at it, the more wrong it looked. Nothing else moved in the parking area. The half-dozen trucks that were parked for the night remained dark and silent. At one point, I thought I saw something near the van, a shadow that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at it. But when I focused on the spot, there was nothing there. Clyde arrived with Deputy Rex Caldwell from the county sheriff's office. They spent about 30 minutes examining the van and the surrounding area with flashlights, looking for footprints or signs of where the family might have gone. When they came back inside, both of them looked puzzled and concerned. "No sign of them anywhere," Caldwell said, settling his considerable bulk into one of the diner chairs. "Van's registered to a Robert Henley from Phoenix. I'll run the plates and see what comes up, but there's no evidence of foul play. People abandon vehicles sometimes, though usually not in such good condition." "What about the family?" I asked. "I saw 4 people get into that van. I heard them arguing." Caldwell shrugged. "Could be they had another ride waiting. Could be they walked to meet someone. Could be a lot of things. Without security cameras covering the back lot, there's no way to know for sure what happened." But I knew what I'd seen. A family of 4 had driven into our parking lot, and somehow they'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind a vehicle that looked like it had never been occupied. The van sat in our lot for 3 days before a tow truck came to get it. During those 3 days, I worked 2 more night shifts, and both times I noticed things about that van that didn't feel right. The interior light stayed on the whole time, even though the door was closed and the battery should have died. On the second night, I could swear I saw movement inside it, shadows shifting behind the fogged windows like people were moving around inside. But when Clyde checked it the next morning, he said the battery was completely dead and had been for at least 24 hours. There was no way the interior light could have been on. On the third night, Tuesday batteries came in as usual. Same time, same items, same routine. But when he was paying, he looked at me with those pale gray eyes and said, "They're gone now." "Who's gone?" "The family in the van. They won't be back." He took his change and started toward the door, then paused in a way that was completely unlike his normal behavior. "But others will come. They always do." "What do you mean by that?" He turned to look at me one more time, and for the first time since I'd known him, his expression seemed almost human, almost sympathetic. "This place sits on an old route, not the interstate. Older than that, much older. Some roads don't show up on maps anymore, but people still travel them. You'll see." Then he left, got in his truck, and drove away. For the first time since I'd been working there, he turned west like he'd always said he was going. I never saw Tuesday batteries again. The incidents didn't stop with the vanishing family. If anything, they got stranger and more frequent. 2 weeks later, I had a trucker come in around 2:30 a.m. who seemed normal enough at first. Big guy, maybe 45, wearing a cat baseball cap and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better days. He bought coffee and a sandwich, paid cash, made small talk about the weather and road conditions. But when he was leaving, he stopped at the door and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You ever hear voices in here at night?" "What kind of voices?" "Like people talking, but you can't quite make out the words, and when you try to listen closer, they stop." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but unable to let it go. I had heard something like that, actually. Soft conversations that seemed to come from the direction of the shower area, even when I knew it was empty and locked. I'd always assumed it was pipes creaking or wind through the ventilation system, but now that he mentioned it... "Sometimes," I admitted. He nodded grimly. "This place has history, bad history. You might want to think about finding a different job." "What kind of history?" But he was already walking out the door. I watched him get into his truck and pull away, and I realized I was shaking. That same week, I started researching the history of our location during my downtime at work. It took some digging through old newspaper archives and county records that were available online. But what I found made my blood run cold and explained a lot about the strange atmosphere that seemed to permeate the place. Rusty's Junction was built on the site of an old trading post that dated back to the 1800s. The trading post had been a stop on a route used by travelers moving between Santa Fe and the mining camps in Colorado, back when the area was still frontier territory, and the journey between settlements could take weeks through dangerous, largely unmapped terrain. According to the historical records I could find, the trading post had been the site of several violent incidents over the years: robberies, murders, unexplained disappearances. The worst incident happened in 1887, when an entire family traveling through the area vanished overnight without a trace. They'd stopped at the trading post for supplies and to rest their horses, planning to continue their journey the next morning. The family's wagon was found the next day, still hitched to their horses and loaded with all their possessions. But the family was nowhere to be found. The local sheriff conducted an extensive search of the surrounding area, but no trace of them was ever discovered. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where they might have gone or what might have happened to them. Over the years that followed, other travelers reported strange incidents at the trading post location. People heard voices when no one was around, saw figures moving in the shadows that disappeared when approached directly, witnessed other travelers simply vanish without explanation. Some reported being approached by people in outdated clothing who spoke of roads and destinations that didn't exist on any maps. By the early 1900s, most travelers were avoiding the area entirely, taking longer routes to avoid having to stop at what had become known locally as the Lost Place. The trading post was eventually abandoned in the 1920s and left to decay in the desert sun. When the interstate system was built in the 1960s, the highway department chose to run the road right through the old trading post site, probably without knowing or caring about its history. Rusty's Junction was built in 1973, directly on top of where the main building of the trading post had stood. I was reading about all this on my phone during a slow period around 3 a.m. when I heard the voices for the first time myself. They were coming from the direction of the shower facilities, soft and indistinct, like people having a conversation in another room. But I knew the showers were empty. I'd just checked them an hour earlier as part of my routine security walkthrough. I tried to ignore the voices, telling myself it was just the building settling or maybe the heating system acting up. But they continued for almost 10 minutes, and at one point, I could swear I heard a child laughing, the same high-pitched sound I'd heard from the direction of the van that night. When the voices finally stopped, the silence that followed was so complete, it felt oppressive. Even the usual building noises, the hum of the refrigeration units, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the clicking of the heating system, seemed muted, like someone had turned down the volume on reality itself. That's when I noticed the man standing in the shower hallway. He was tall and thin, wearing clothes that looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1800s. A dark coat that reached almost to his knees, boots that looked handmade rather than manufactured, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows over his face. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing toward the main store area, facing toward me. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me after hours of staring at security monitors and inventory sheets, but he was still there when I opened them. I couldn't make out his facial features because of the shadows cast by his hat, but I could feel him watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Excuse me?" I called out, my voice shaky despite my efforts to sound professional and authoritative. "The shower facilities are closed right now." He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there in the hallway like a statue, like he'd been carved from stone and placed there by some unseen hand. I grabbed the flashlight we kept behind the counter and started walking toward the shower area, my heart pounding but my training telling me to investigate and resolve the situation. "Sir, the facilities are closed until 6 a.m. As I got closer, I could see him more clearly in the beam of my flashlight. His clothes were definitely from another era. That long dark coat looked like something a frontier preacher might wear, and his boots were clearly handmade with leather that looked old and weathered. His face was pale, almost gray, with sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes. But his eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight and reflect nothing back. I stopped walking. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get away from this thing that was definitely not human despite its roughly human shape. But I was frozen in place, staring into those black, empty eyes that seemed to contain depths I couldn't fathom. The man tilted his head slightly, like a curious animal examining something it didn't quite understand, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from a great distance, echoing through tunnels or across vast empty spaces. "The road is old," he said, and each word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. "Older than your roads. We've been traveling it for a long time." "What? What do you want?" I managed to whisper, though my throat felt like it was closing up. "To continue our journey, as we always have." He took a step toward me, and I noticed that his boots made no sound on the tile floor, like he was floating just above the surface. "Some paths don't end, girl. They just persist." I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears and feel it in my throat. The man followed, not walking but gliding, his black eyes never leaving mine, his expression never changing from that curious, almost puzzled look. "The family you saw," he continued, his voice still echoing from that impossible distance. "They joined us, as others have, as others will. I don't understand. This place remembers. It calls to travelers, offers them rest, gives them a choice. Some choose to continue on the new road, with its maps and schedules and destinations. Others choose the old path, where time moves differently and distance is measured in different ways." I was almost back to the counter now, my hand fumbling for the phone to call 911, though I had no idea what I'd tell them. But when I glanced down to dial the number and then looked back up, the man was gone. The shower hallway was empty. The only sound was the buzz of that defective fluorescent light and my own ragged breathing. I called Clyde again, and this time I was crying when he answered. "I'm quitting," I told him through my tears. "I can't do this anymore." "What happened, Opal?" I told him about the man in old-fashioned clothes, about the black eyes, about the conversation that didn't make sense but felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. Clyde was quiet for a long time, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Opal?" he said finally, his voice sounding older and more tired than I'd ever heard it. "I should have told you sooner. You're not the first person to see things like that. Night shift workers here. They don't usually last long. We've had 6 people quit in the past 2 years, all for similar reasons." "Why didn't you warn me?" "Because we need someone to work the nights. And if I told people the truth, nobody would take the job. I hope maybe you'd be different. Maybe you wouldn't see anything. Some people don't, you know. Some people work here for years and never notice anything unusual." "See anything? Clyde, this place is haunted." "Maybe. Or maybe it's something else. Something older than ghosts. Something that was here before we built over it." But the man with the black eyes wasn't finished with me. Over the next 2 weeks, as I worked out my notice on day shifts only, I started experiencing things that followed me home. I'd be driving back to my apartment in Albuquerque in the early morning, and I'd see that same figure standing on the side of the road, always in the same old-fashioned clothes, always watching as I passed. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, seeing things that weren't there after working long shifts and dealing with the stress of the supernatural encounters. But the sightings became more frequent and more specific. He'd be standing at bus stops, in parking lots outside grocery stores, in the shadows near my apartment building. Always watching, never moving, never approaching, but always there. The breaking point came during my last week of work. I was doing inventory in the storage room behind the convenience store when I heard footsteps in the main area. Heavy boots on tile, walking slowly and deliberately toward the storage room where I was working. I looked through the doorway and saw him again, the man in the old-fashioned clothes, walking through the store like he owned the place, like he belonged there more than I did. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked the family from the van, the same family I'd seen disappear weeks earlier. The father, the mother who'd never moved, and the 2 terrified children. They were all walking in single file, following the man in the black coat with mechanical precision. But they looked different, changed. Their skin had that same pale gray quality as the man's, and their eyes were empty. Not black like his, but empty of everything that makes eyes human. Empty of awareness, of personality, of life itself. They looked like people, but they moved like puppets, like something else was controlling their movements. They walked past the storage room without looking in my direction, heading toward the back of the building, toward the shower area. I heard a door open and close, and then silence. I waited in that storage room for 20 minutes before I had the courage to come out. When I did, the store was empty again. No sign that anyone had been there except for wet footprints leading from the front door to the shower hallway. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. The footprints weren't from water. They were dark, almost black, and they had a smell to them. Sweet and unpleasant, like the smell I'd noticed in the abandoned van. I followed the footprints to the shower area, though every rational part of my brain was screaming at me not to. The trail led to shower room 7, the same room where I'd heard the knocking that first night months ago. The door was closed, but I could hear sounds coming from inside. Not voices exactly, but movement, like people getting dressed or undressed. Rustling fabric, shuffling feet, the sound of water running. I knocked on the door. "Hello? Is someone in there?" The sounds stopped immediately. Complete silence, just like that night with the van. I tried the door handle. It was locked, which was impossible because none of the shower room doors had locks that could be engaged from the inside. The facility was designed to prevent people from barricading themselves in the rooms. I stood there for a few minutes, listening, but heard nothing more. When I finally worked up the courage to get the master key and unlock the door, the room was empty, completely empty, and bone dry, like no one had used it in days. But the temperature in that room was so cold I could see my breath, and scratched into the tile wall, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a message. The old road welcomes all travelers. I didn't finish my 2 weeks' notice. I left that night and never went back. But the experiences didn't stop when I quit Rusty's Junction. If anything, they got worse. The man in the old-fashioned clothes started appearing more frequently, and now he was bringing others with him. Not just the family from the van, but other people I'd seen during my time at the truck stop. Drivers who'd stopped for fuel or food, customers who'd bought supplies and moved on. They'd appear at the edge of my vision when I was driving, standing in groups by the side of the road. They'd be in parking lots when I went shopping, in restaurants when I went out to eat. Always watching, always silent, always perfectly still. The worst part was that I started recognizing some of them. Faces I remembered from my months working the night shift. People who'd seemed perfectly normal when they were alive, but now had that same empty stare, that same pale gray skin. I realized they weren't just random customers who'd passed through. They were people who'd made the choice the man had talked about. People who'd chosen the old road instead of the new one. And somehow, by working at Rusty's Junction, by witnessing their transition, I'd become connected to them. I'd become part of their endless journey, whether I wanted to be or not. I tried moving to different cities, but it didn't matter. They followed me everywhere. I tried changing jobs, changing my routine, even changing my name. Nothing worked. They were always there, waiting, watching, reminding me that I'd seen them cross over from one world to another. 3 months after I quit, I was living in Denver and working at a bookstore when a customer came in who looked familiar. It took me a moment to recognize him. It was the trucker who'd warned me about the voices, the one who'd told me the place had bad history. But he looked different now, older, grayer, with that same empty stare I'd come to recognize in the others. He ordered a coffee from our little Cafe C area, paid with exact change, and was turning to leave when he stopped and looked directly at me. "You worked at Rusty's Junction," he said. It wasn't a question. "For a while," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "Did you see them, the travelers on the old road?" "Yes." "Then you understand. Once you've seen them, really seen them, you can't unsee them. You become part of their world, whether you want to or not." "What do they want?" "Nothing. Everything. They want to continue their journey and they want others to join them. It's not malicious. It's just what they do, what they've always done, what they'll always do." He started toward the door, then paused. "The choice is coming for you soon. You'll know when it's time." What choice? But he was already gone, walking out into the bright Colorado sunshine like any other customer. That night, I had the first dream about the old road. I was driving through empty desert, following a route that didn't exist on any map I'd ever seen. The road was dirt and gravel, winding between rock formations that looked older than time, under a sky that held too many stars. As I drove, I passed other travelers, some in cars, some in trucks, some walking. All of them had that same pale gray skin, that same empty stare. They waved as I passed, welcoming me to their eternal journey. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, but I could still smell the desert dust and feel the vibration of the old road beneath my feet. The dreams came every night after that, each one more vivid than the last, each one making the old road seem more real, more appealing than the world I was living in. Each one showing me more travelers, more people who'd made the choice to join the endless journey. During the day, I'd see more of them. The travelers from the old road, standing in groups, always watching, always waiting. Sometimes I'd recognize faces from the truck stop. Tuesday Batteries was among them, still wearing his faded blue work shirt, still carrying that bag of batteries he'd bought every week. He never approached me directly, but I'd see him everywhere, At the grocery store, at the gas station, outside my apartment building. Always there, always watching, always reminding me that I'd been marked by my time at Rusty's Junction. The breaking point came 6 months after I'd quit. I was driving home from work one evening when I saw a familiar sight ahead. A dark blue minivan with Arizona plates, parked on the shoulder of the highway. The same van the family had been driving that night at Rusty's Junction. I should have kept driving. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to keep going, to not get involved. But something compelled me to pull over. The van was empty, just like it had been that night in the truck stop parking lot. But the driver's door was open, and the keys were in the ignition. The engine was running. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. I turned around and saw him, the man in the old-fashioned clothes, walking toward me with that same gliding gait I remembered from the truck stop. "Hello, Opal," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it, distant, echoing, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "What do you want?" "To offer you the same choice I offer all travelers. The new road or the old road." "I'm not a traveler. I'm just trying to live my life." He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. Not because it was malevolent, but because it was genuinely kind, genuinely caring, genuinely understanding. Everyone is a traveler, Opal. Some people just don't know it yet. What happens if I choose the old road? You join us. You become part of something larger than yourself, something that has existed since before your highways, before your cities, before your civilization. You become part of the eternal journey. And if I choose the new road? You continue as you are, but you'll always know we're here. You'll always see us, always feel us watching. The old road will call to you every day until you can't resist anymore. I looked around at the empty highway, at the vast desert stretching in all directions. In the distance, I could see other figures approaching. The travelers from the old road, coming to witness my decision. How long do I have to decide? No time at all the time in the world. The choice is always now, Opal. It's always been now. I closed my eyes and tried to think clearly. What kind of life was I living? Constantly looking over my shoulder, constantly afraid of shadows that might or might not be there. What kind of existence was it to be forever haunted by something I'd witnessed during 8 months of working the night shift at a truck stop? When I opened my eyes, the man was closer. Close enough that I could see myself reflected in those black, pupilless eyes. "The old road welcomes all travelers," he said, repeating the words I'd seen scratched into the shower room wall. I looked at the van, still running, still waiting. I looked at the travelers gathering in the distance, silent and patient and eternal. And I made my choice. I'm telling you this story now because someone needs to know what happened to me, and what happens to anyone who works the night shift in certain places along America's highways. Places where the old roads intersect with the new ones, where the past refuses to stay buried, where time moves differently than it does in the rest of the world. I'm telling you this because if you're ever driving through northern New Mexico on Interstate 25, and you see exit 127, and you see the ruins of what used to be Rusty's Junction truck stop, you should keep driving. Don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because some roads never end. Some journeys continue forever, and some choices once made can never be unmade. The old road is still there, just beyond the edge of what your maps can show you, and we're still traveling it. All of us who chose to join the eternal journey instead of fighting it. Sometimes, late at night, we appear to people who work in lonely places along the highways. We offer them the same choice that was offered to us. Some refuse and spend the rest of their lives haunted by what they've seen. Others accept and join us on the road that has no beginning and no end. I chose the old road that night on the highway shoulder. I chose to join the eternal journey, to become part of something that existed before maps and will exist after the last highway crumbles back to dust. You might think that was the end of my story, but it's really just the beginning. Because now I'm one of the travelers, one of the watchers, one of the ones who appears to people working the night shift in lonely places. I've seen the world from the perspective of the old road, and I can tell you that time moves differently here. What feels like moments can be years in your world, and what feels like centuries can be heartbeats. We exist in the spaces between seconds, in the gaps between thoughts, in the silence between words. We travel routes that were old when your ancestors were learning to make fire. We stop at places that remember what the land was like before your cities, before your roads, before your civilization carved its scars across the earth. And sometimes, we stop at truck stops. Not to cause harm, not to frighten or threaten or hurt, but to offer the choice. To give people the opportunity to join something eternal, something that transcends the temporary concerns of your linear existence. Most people can't see us. They live their lives focused on destinations and schedules, on getting from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. They don't notice the travelers on the old road, don't see the paths that wind through spaces between spaces. But some people can see us. Usually people who work alone, who spend long hours in liminal places where the boundary between one world and another grows thin. Night shift workers, security guards, truck drivers who've been on the road too long. People like you might become, if you're not careful. The truck stop where I used to work, Rusty's Junction, was torn down 3 years after I left. The state was widening the interstate, and the building was right in the path of the new construction. The demolition crew reported some strange incidents during the teardown. Tools going missing, equipment malfunctioning for no apparent reason, workers hearing voices when no one else was around. But the strangest thing, according to Clyde, who called to tell me about it, was what they found when they were digging up the foundation. Buried beneath the concrete floor of the main building, they discovered the remains of an old stone foundation that looked much older than anything that should have been there. The stones were arranged in a pattern that didn't match any known architectural style, and some of them had markings carved into them that nobody could identify. Strange symbols that looked like they might be writing, but not in any language anyone recognized. The construction supervisor wanted to call in archaeologists to examine the find, but the next morning, all the stones were gone, just vanished overnight, along with any evidence that they'd ever been there. The new truck stop that replaced Rusty's Junction is bright and modern, with LED lighting, security cameras, and all the amenities that travelers expect in the 21st century. It's located about half a mile east of the original site, on a patch of ground that has no history, no stories, no connection to the old routes that crisscrossed the territory before highways existed. From what I hear, the night shift workers there don't report any unusual incidents. No strange customers, no unexplained voices, no men in old-fashioned clothing with black eyes. But sometimes I wonder if moving the truck stop really solved the problem, or if it just moved the problem somewhere else. Because roads have a way of finding new paths when the old ones are blocked, and travelers, whatever kind of travelers they might be, have a way of adapting to changes in the landscape. Maybe they're still out there, following routes that exist in the spaces between your maps, stopping at places that serve as crossroads between the world you understand and the worlds you don't. Maybe they're still offering choices to anyone willing to listen, still calling to people who work the night shifts in lonely places where the boundary between past and present grows thin. I hope you never find out. But late at night, when you're alone and the world feels vast and mysterious, if you start seeing things that don't quite make sense, if you start hearing voices that speak of journeys without end, if you start noticing travelers who don't quite fit the patterns you expect, Remember this story. Remember that some roads are older than the ones we've mapped. Remember that some choices, once offered, will keep being offered until they're accepted. And remember that when the choice comes, and it will come, if you've truly seen us, you'll have to decide whether you want to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, or whether you want to join something larger than yourself. But let me tell you more about what I've learned during my time on the old road, because there are things you need to understand if you're going to protect yourself from what's coming. The old road isn't just one path. It's a network, a web of routes that stretch across the continent and beyond, connecting places that exist outside of normal geography. Some of these routes follow ancient Native American trails, others trace the paths of early European explorers, and still others seem to have no connection to human history at all, as if they were carved into the landscape by forces that predate human civilization entirely. Every truck stop, every gas station, every rest area sits at the intersection of these old and new roads, whether the people who built them knew it or not. Most of the time, the intersection is dormant, inactive. The old road sleeps beneath the new one, and travelers pass through without ever knowing what lies beneath the asphalt and concrete. But sometimes, the intersection becomes active. Usually during certain times of year, or when specific atmospheric conditions align, or when enough travelers have passed through to weaken the barrier between worlds. When that happens, people start disappearing. Not in dramatic ways that attract attention, but quietly, subtly. A family checks into a motel and is never seen checking out. A trucker stops for fuel and never arrives at his destination. A night shift worker simply doesn't show up for their next shift. The authorities investigate, of course. Missing person reports are filed, search parties are organized, theories are developed. But the investigators are looking for explanations that exist within their understanding of reality, and what's actually happening operates according to much older rules. The people who disappear aren't kidnapped or murdered in any conventional sense. They're offered a choice, just like I was, and some of them choose to step off the new road and onto the old one, to become part of a journey that has no end. I've met dozens of them during my time traveling the old road. Truck drivers from the 1950s who stepped out of their cabs one night and never looked back. Gas station attendants from the 1960s who walked away from their shifts and into something larger than themselves. Travelers from every decade since the interstate system was built, all of them carrying their own stories about the moment they were offered the choice. But it's not just modern travelers. The old road has been collecting passengers for centuries, maybe millennia. I've encountered traders from the 1800s, still wearing their period clothing, still carrying the goods they were transporting when they decided to join the eternal journey. Native Americans who were traveling the paths before Europeans ever set foot on the continent. People whose origins stretch back so far that their stories have become legends, myths, cautionary tales told around campfires. We're all part of the same endless migration now, following routes that exist outside of time and space as you understand them. We move between worlds, between dimensions, between possibilities. Sometimes we travel through the past, witnessing events that shaped the landscape we move through. Sometimes we glimpse the future, seeing what will become of the roads and cities and civilizations that think themselves permanent. And sometimes we return to the present, to the world of truck stops and gas stations and interstate highways, to offer the choice to others who might be ready to join us. I've been back to the site where Rusty's Junction used to stand many times over the years. The new truck stop is exactly as I described, bright, modern, efficient. But late at night, when the barriers between worlds grow thin, you can still see traces of what was there before. The old stone foundation is still there, buried beneath the parking lot of the new facility. The symbols carved into the stones still pulse with whatever energy created them centuries ago. And sometimes, when conditions are right, travelers on the old road stop there just as they always have. The new night shift workers can't see us most of the time. They're too focused on their schedules and procedures, too grounded in the reality of credit card transactions and inventory counts. But occasionally, one of them will glimpse something out of the corner of their eye. A figure in old-fashioned clothing walking through the parking lot. Voices speaking in languages that predate English. Vehicles that look like they belong in a different century. When that happens, when someone starts to see through the barriers that separate the old road from the new one, we know they're candidates for the choice. Not immediately. It takes time for the connection to strengthen, for the visions to become clear, for the person to understand what they're really seeing. But eventually, the choice comes. It always does, for people who've truly seen us. I was present the last time it happened at the new truck stop. A young man named Marcus, who'd been working the night shift for about 6 months, started reporting strange incidents to his supervisor. Customers who paid with coins that looked antique. Voices speaking in the shower area when it was supposed to be empty. Vehicles parked in the lot that weren't there when he checked the security cameras. His supervisor, a practical woman who'd never worked nights herself, dismissed the reports as stress and exhaustion. She suggested Marcus switch to day shifts, take a vacation, maybe see a doctor about possible sleep disorders. But Marcus knew what he was seeing was real. He started researching the history of the location, just like I had years earlier. He found the same newspaper articles about the old trading post, the same records of disappearances and strange incidents. And he began to understand that he was part of a pattern that stretched back much further than the existence of the modern truck stop. The night I approached him, he was doing inventory in the storage room, just like I had been during my last week at Rusty's Junction. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see in his eyes that he recognized me from his dreams. "You're one of them," he said. Not a question, just a statement of fact. "Yes," I told him. "And you're ready to choose." We talked for an hour about the old road, about the nature of the journey, about what it meant to step outside of linear time and become part of something eternal. Marcus asked intelligent questions, showed genuine understanding of what I was offering. In the end, he chose the old road, just as I had years earlier. He walked out of that storage room and into a world larger than anything he'd imagined possible. His supervisor found a resignation letter on her desk the next morning, typed and signed, giving 2 weeks' notice for personal reasons. But Marcus never showed up to work those final shifts. The security cameras showed him leaving the building that night, but they never showed him getting into a vehicle or walking to the parking lot. He simply walked toward the back of the building and vanished from their electronic record. The police investigated, of course. They interviewed his family, checked his bank accounts, analyzed his phone records. But people who choose the old road leave very few traces in your digital world. We exist between the spaces that your surveillance systems can monitor. That was 3 years ago. Marcus travels with us now, learning the routes that existed before maps, discovering destinations that don't appear in any guidebook. Like all of us, he's finding that the journey itself is more important than any specific destination. Which brings me to why I'm telling you this story now in such detail, with such specific warnings about the places and signs to watch for. The old road is becoming more active. The barriers between worlds are weakening, and the intersections where we can appear to travelers on the new road are becoming more numerous and more frequent. What used to happen once or twice a year at a given location is now happening monthly, sometimes weekly. More night shift workers are reporting unusual incidents. More families are disappearing from rest areas and truck stops. More drivers are abandoning their vehicles and walking away from lives they no longer want to live. The network of the old road is expanding, creating new connections, new crossroads, new opportunities for people to step out of linear time and into something eternal. And each person who makes that choice strengthens the network, makes it easier for others to see us, easier for the choice to be offered. I don't know why this is happening now. Maybe it's a natural cycle, something that occurs every few centuries when enough travelers have accumulated on the old road. Maybe it's a response to changes in your world, the increasing pace of life, the growing disconnection from the natural world, the sense that many people have of being trapped in lives that feel meaningless. Or maybe it's something else entirely, something connected to forces larger than human understanding. What I do know is that if you work nights at a truck stop, or a gas station, or any place where travelers pass through in the darkness, your chances of encountering us are higher now than they've been in decades. And if you start seeing things that don't quite make sense, if you start hearing voices that speak of impossible journeys, if you start noticing patterns that suggest something is operating just beyond the edge of your perception, you need to be prepared for the choice when it comes. Because it will come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but if you've truly seen us, if you've genuinely witnessed the travelers on the old road, then you've already been marked. The connection has been made, and it will only grow stronger over time. You can fight it if you want. You can quit your job, move to a different city, try to convince yourself that what you saw wasn't real. Some people do that, and they manage to live out their lives without ever encountering us again. But they're never quite the same afterward. They carry the knowledge of our existence like a weight, always wondering what they might have experienced if they'd made a different choice. They see shadows that might be us in their peripheral vision. They hear whispers in empty rooms that might be our voices calling to them across the barriers between worlds. And sometimes, years later, when they're old and tired and feeling the weight of a life lived entirely within the boundaries of linear time, they start looking for us again. They drive the interstate highways late at night, stopping at truck stops and rest areas, hoping to catch a glimpse of the travelers they once turned away. By then, it's usually too late. The connection has weakened, the barriers have solidified, and the choice is no longer available to them. They die as they lived, trapped within the confines of ordinary existence, never knowing what wonders they might have seen if they'd been brave enough to step onto the old road when the opportunity was offered. That's why I'm telling you this story now, while you're still young enough and aware enough to understand what's being offered. That's why I'm giving you these warnings about the signs to watch for, the patterns to recognize, the choices you'll need to make. The old road welcomes all travelers, but it doesn't wait forever for anyone to decide. The choice, when it comes, must be made in the moment it's offered. There are no second chances, no opportunities to reconsider, no time to weigh the pros and cons. Either you step onto the old road and join the eternal journey, or you remain on the new road and live with the knowledge of what you've seen for the rest of your linear existence. This is my final report as head of security for Desert Wind Travel Plaza, located at mile marker 247 on Interstate 40 in eastern Arizona. I'm submitting this documentation to corporate headquarters in Phoenix, along with my resignation, effective immediately. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I've got 12 years of law enforcement experience and 4 years working security at truck stops across the Southwest. I know the difference between equipment malfunction and something that can't be explained by conventional means. I've also got the security footage to back up everything I'm reporting, at least the parts that the cameras were able to record before they started malfunctioning in ways that our technical support team says shouldn't be possible. My name is Merle Eugene Holbrook, and I've been head of security at Desert Wind Travel Plaza since March 2020. It's a large facility, one of the biggest truck stops on the I-40 corridor between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. We've got 150 parking spaces for commercial vehicles, 2 restaurants, a full-service garage, shower facilities that can accommodate 80 drivers, a 60-room motel, and enough fuel islands to handle the busiest traffic days. I work the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., which means I spend most of my time monitoring our comprehensive security camera system and conducting walking patrols around the property. During peak hours, we might have 200 people on the premises at any given time. After 2 a.m., it's usually quiet except for drivers arriving for mandatory rest periods, the occasional late-night traveler, or maintenance issues that can't wait for morning. The night of November 8th, 2023, started normal enough. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-50s, moderate traffic for a Wednesday night. I had about 60 trucks in the lot, a dozen cars at the fuel islands, and maybe 30 rooms occupied in the motel. Nothing that should have caused any problems. At 11:47 p.m., a driver named Buster McKenzie pulled into Space 73 with a refrigerated load headed for Los Angeles. I knew Buster from his previous stops. Experienced driver, always professional, never any trouble. He parked his rig, completed his post-trip inspection, and headed inside to grab dinner at the main restaurant. Standard routine that I'd seen hundreds of times. That's when the security cameras started recording things that shouldn't have been possible. At 12:15 a.m., I was doing my hourly review of the camera feeds when I noticed something odd on Monitor 7, which covers parking spaces 65 through 80. Buster's truck was there, but there appeared to be someone standing next to his trailer who definitely wasn't Buster. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit and just standing perfectly still beside the truck. This was concerning for multiple reasons. First, unauthorized people wandering around the truck parking area at night is a major security issue. Second, Buster was inside the restaurant, so whoever this was had no legitimate reason to be near his vehicle. Third, I'd been monitoring the cameras continuously, and I hadn't seen anyone approach that truck. I switched to the recorded footage to see where this person had come from. According to the timestamp, at 12:14:47, the parking area around Buster's truck was empty. At 12:14:48, the camera feed flickered briefly, just a momentary disruption that lasted maybe half a second. When the image cleared at 12:14:49, the figure was standing there. Nobody can materialize next to a truck in half a second. It's physically impossible. But there it was, right in the digital record. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed outside to investigate. The truck parking area was well lit by overhead sodium lights, and I could see Buster's rig clearly from about 100 yards away. There was nobody there. No sign that anyone had been there recently. I walked over to examine the area around the truck. The gravel showed no footprints except for Buster's tracks from when he'd done his inspection earlier. I checked the trailer doors, still sealed and locked. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The area around the truck was noticeably colder than the surrounding parking lot. I'm talking about a temperature difference significant enough that I could feel it immediately when I walked into that space. I checked it with my digital thermometer, and the air temperature near the truck was 11 degrees lower than the ambient temperature just 10 feet away. I radioed the main office to report the incident, but got only static in response. My handheld had full signal strength and fresh batteries, but every channel was broadcasting the same low-level interference with occasional sounds that might have been voices if you listened carefully enough. At 12:43 a.m., I was back in the security office reviewing the footage when Monitor 12 went completely black. Monitor 12 covers the shower and restroom facilities, and it had been working perfectly all evening. I checked the connections, tried resetting the system, even went outside to physically examine the camera housing. Everything appeared normal, but the camera simply wasn't transmitting any image. That's when I heard the knocking. It was coming from the direction of the shower facilities, a slow, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on a door. But according to our electronic keycard system, all the shower rooms were unoccupied, and the doors to empty rooms don't lock from the inside anyway. I took my flashlight and went to investigate, following the sound down the hallway to the shower area. The knocking was definitely coming from shower room 15, which our system showed as vacant and available. "Maintenance?" I called out, thinking maybe someone was working on plumbing issues during the overnight hours. "Is someone in there?" The knocking stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ventilation fans in other parts of the building, but nothing from room 15. I tried the door handle. It turned freely, and the door opened to reveal an empty shower room. The lights were off. There was no sign that anyone had been inside recently, and all the surfaces were bone dry like they hadn't been used in hours. But the temperature in that room was at least 20 degrees colder than the hallway, and my breath was visible when I exhaled. I checked 3 other shower rooms, and they were all normal temperature. I closed the door to room 15 and was heading back to the security office when I heard the knocking start again. This time it was coming from room 23, on the opposite end of the hallway. I didn't investigate room 23. Something about the whole situation was setting off every alarm bell I had, and my 12 years of law enforcement experience was telling me to document everything and call for backup rather than wandering around alone investigating supernatural phenomena. Except Monitor 12 was still dead, so I couldn't document anything happening in the shower area. At 1:18 a.m., multiple cameras started malfunctioning simultaneously. Monitors 3, 7, 11, and 15 all went dark within a span of 10 minutes. These cameras covered different areas of the facility and were connected to separate circuits, so there was no technical reason for them to fail together. I started a manual patrol of the areas where cameras had failed, beginning with the fuel islands covered by Monitor 3. Everything looked normal there. One truck fueling up, the driver standing beside his cab smoking a cigarette and talking on his cell phone. The driver was someone I'd never seen before, maybe 60 years old, wearing a baseball cap and work clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. When I approached, he nodded politely and said good evening. "Busy night?" he asked, flicking ash from his cigarette. "Quiet enough," I replied. "Just making my rounds. You passing through?" "Always passing through," he said. But something about the way he said it made me look at him more closely. That's when I noticed his truck. It was an older model Kenworth, probably from the late 1970s, painted in a faded red and white color scheme that looked original to the vehicle. The truck was in remarkable condition for its age. No rust, no dents, chrome that gleamed even under the harsh sodium parking lot lights. But there was no fuel nozzle connected to it. The driver was standing next to the truck like he was fueling up. The pump was showing an active transaction on the digital display, but there was no fuel line running from the pump to the vehicle. "Having trouble with the pump?" I asked. The driver looked down at the pump, then back at me. "Seems to be working fine." I looked at the display again. It was showing that he'd pumped 127 gallons of diesel fuel, which was impossible for multiple reasons. First, his truck's fuel tanks couldn't hold that much. Second, 127 gallons would have taken at least 25 minutes to pump, but I'd only been watching him for about 5 minutes. Third, there was no fuel line connected to his truck. "Sir, I think there might be a problem with the pump. Let me reset it for you." "No need," he said. "I'm finished." He walked around to the driver's side of his truck and climbed up into the cab like everything was perfectly normal. I watched as he started the engine and began to pull away from the fuel island. According to the pump display, he'd purchased $400 in 2023 worth of diesel fuel without ever connecting a hose to his vehicle. I ran back to the security office to review the footage from the fuel island cameras, but Monitor 3 was still dead. There was no digital record of what I'd just witnessed. At 1:45 a.m., I was trying to get the camera system back online when I heard voices coming from the parking area. Multiple people talking, but too distant and muffled for me to make out words. I looked out the office window and could see several figures moving between the trucks, but the lighting wasn't good enough to see details. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to investigate. The parking area appeared empty when I got there, but I could still hear the voices. They seemed to be coming from different directions, sometimes close, sometimes far away, like people were having conversations while walking around the lot. I followed the voices toward the back section of the parking area, where our overflow spaces are located. As I got closer, I could make out what sounded like multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Men's voices, women's voices, even what might have been children talking. But every time I got close to where the voices seemed to be coming from, they would stop, and I'd hear them start up again from a different location. This continued for about 15 minutes. I'd walk toward voices in one area, they'd stop, then I'd hear different voices from another direction. It was like playing a game of acoustic hide-and-seek with invisible people. Finally, I stopped moving and just stood still in the middle of the parking area, listening. The voices continued around me, definitely human voices having normal conversations, but I couldn't understand the words. It was like listening to people talking in another room through thick walls. Then I realized what was bothering me about the voices. They weren't just muffled or distant. They sounded old. Not elderly, but old in a different way, like recordings from decades ago that had been played through vintage equipment. The speech patterns, the cadence, even the background sounds were subtly different from modern conversations. At 2:07 a.m., I returned to the security office to find that all the dead monitors had suddenly come back online. Every camera was working perfectly, showing clear images of their assigned areas. But according to the system logs, they'd never gone offline. The computer showed continuous recording throughout the entire time I'd been experiencing the malfunctions. I reviewed the recorded footage from the past 2 hours, looking for evidence of the incidents I'd witnessed. The timestamp showed that at 12:14, there was indeed a brief flicker on monitor 7. But when the image cleared, there was no figure standing next to Buster's truck. The parking area was empty, just as it should have been. The fuel island footage showed the driver I'd encountered, but in the recorded version, he was properly connected to the fuel pump and conducting a normal transaction. The pump display showed a reasonable amount of fuel being dispensed, and he paid with a credit card in the normal way. The shower area footage was the most disturbing. According to the cameras, I'd never gone to investigate any knocking sounds. The recordings showed me sitting in the security office the entire time, with no audio of knocking or any other unusual sounds. But I knew what I'd experienced. I had the temperature readings on my digital thermometer to prove that something unusual had happened in those shower rooms. I had the memory of standing in rooms that were 20 degrees colder than they should have been, of hearing knocking sounds that had no source. The problem was, none of it existed in the digital record. At 2:33 a.m., a new truck pulled into the parking area, a blue Freightliner with Nevada plates. The driver was a woman, maybe 40 years old, who parked in Space 94 and headed inside for what I assumed would be a meal and shower before her mandatory rest period. 20 minutes later, Monitor 14 picked up movement in the parking area near her truck. A figure was walking slowly around the Freightliner, appearing to examine it carefully. The figure was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dark suit, just like the one I'd seen earlier near Buster's truck. This time, I was ready. I had cameras recording, I had my digital thermometer, and I was determined to document whatever was happening at our facility. I grabbed my equipment and headed outside, keeping my radio tuned to the security channel in case I needed backup. The figure was still visible on the monitor when I left the office, walking slowly around the truck like it was conducting some kind of inspection. When I reached Space 94, there was nobody there. But the area around the truck was significantly colder than the surrounding parking lot, just like it had been earlier. I documented the temperature difference, 13 degrees lower than ambient, and took photos of the truck and surrounding area. I was taking measurements when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. I turned around and saw the female driver walking toward me from the direction of the main building. "Is there a problem with my truck?" she asked, looking concerned. "Just conducting a routine security check," I told her. "Did you see anyone around your vehicle in the past few minutes?" She shook her head. "I've been inside getting dinner. Why?" I explained that our cameras had picked up someone in the area and I was investigating. She walked around her truck with me, checking that everything was secure, but we found no evidence that anyone had tampered with anything. "That's weird," she said, looking at my thermometer. "Why is it so cold right here? It feels like someone left a freezer door open." So I wasn't imagining the temperature anomalies. Other people could feel them too. After the driver went back inside, I returned to the security office and reviewed the footage from monitor 14. According to the recording, there had never been any figure walking around the truck. The timestamp showed me leaving the office, walking to space 94, taking temperature readings, and talking to the driver. But there was no record of the figure I'd seen on the monitor just minutes earlier. The computer logs showed that monitor 14 had been recording continuously, with no interruptions, no malfunctions, no technical problems. Yet somehow, what I'd seen on the screen in real time didn't exist in the recorded footage. At 3:15 a.m., things escalated significantly. I was reviewing camera feeds when I noticed unusual activity on multiple monitors simultaneously. Figures were walking through various areas of the facility: the parking lot, the fuel islands, the area around the motel. Not just one or two people, but dozens of them, all moving with purpose but in directions that didn't make sense. Some appeared to be walking through solid objects: trucks, buildings, fuel pumps. Others were moving in straight lines that took them into areas where there were no paths or walkways. All of them were wearing clothing that looked like it came from different time periods, ranging from what might have been 1950s work clothes to more formal attire that could have been from the early 1900s. I called up the recorded footage on a second monitor to document what I was seeing, but the recordings showed empty parking lots and normal facility operations. Whatever was happening was visible in real time, but wasn't being captured by the digital recording system. I grabbed my radio to call for backup from the county sheriff's office, but every channel was broadcasting the same interference I'd encountered earlier. Instead of static, though, I was hearing voices. Dozens of different voices, all talking at once, creating a cacophony of conversation that made it impossible to understand individual words. The voices sounded like they were coming from different decades. Some had the clear, formal speech patterns of radio announcers from the 1940s. Others used slang and expressions that seemed to come from various periods throughout the latter half of the 20th century. A few sounded more contemporary, but even those seemed somehow disconnected from the present moment. I tried my cell phone, but it was showing no signal despite being in an area where coverage was normally excellent. At 3:47 a.m., the situation became completely surreal. All of the monitors in the security office were now showing the facility as it existed in real time, but populated with people who shouldn't have been there. I could see them walking through the parking lot, standing in groups near the fuel islands, entering and exiting the shower facilities. Some were driving vehicles that looked like they came from different eras. Trucks from the 1960s and 70s, cars that appeared to be from even earlier periods. But when I looked out the office window at the actual facility, everything appeared normal. Empty parking spaces where the monitors showed vintage trucks, quiet fuel islands where the screens displayed clusters of people in period clothing. I was witnessing two different versions of reality simultaneously. One visible through the security cameras, one visible through direct observation. And they didn't match. The most disturbing part was that the people on the monitors seemed to be aware of the camera system. Some of them would look directly into the cameras, as if they knew they were being watched. A few even appeared to be trying to communicate, holding up signs or gesturing toward the cameras in ways that suggested they had messages they wanted to convey. One figure in particular caught my attention. An older man wearing a 1950s-style work uniform was standing directly in front of camera 8, holding what appeared to be a handwritten sign. I zoomed in on the image and could make out the words, "Help us find the road home." I tried to respond by speaking into the camera microphone, asking if he could hear me, but there was no indication that any sound was getting through to whatever realm or dimension these people existed in. At 4:23 a.m., I made a decision that I immediately regretted. I left the security office and walked out into the parking area, hoping to make direct contact with whoever or whatever was creating these manifestations. I could see them clearly on the monitors. Dozens of people in period clothing, vintage vehicles, signs of activity throughout the facility. But when I stepped outside, I was alone in a normal, quiet truck stop parking lot. I walked to the exact spot where I'd seen the man with the sign on camera 8. According to the monitor, he was still standing there, still holding his message about finding the road home. But I was standing in an empty space, feeling only the normal night air and seeing only the standard sodium light illumination. Then I heard my name being called. "Merle," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can see us now." I looked around but saw nobody. The voice seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Who's there?" I called out. "Workers, travelers, people who got lost between one place and another." The voice was clearer now, coming from a specific direction, toward the shower facilities. I walked in that direction and gradually began to see them. Not clearly at first, just shapes and shadows that seemed more solid than they should have been. But as I got closer, the figures became more distinct. There were dozens of people in the area around the shower building. Men and women wearing clothing from various decades, all looking tired and confused, like they'd been traveling for a very long time without reaching their destination. "What do you want?" I asked. "To finish our journeys," said the voice. It was coming from the man I'd seen on the monitor, the one with the sign. Up close, I could see that his work uniform had a name patch that read Frank, and a logo for a trucking company I didn't recognize. "Where are you trying to go?" "Home," he said, "but the roads keep changing. We stop here to rest, to figure out which direction to take, but when we try to leave, we end up back where we started." "How long have you been here?" Frank looked confused by the question. "Time moves differently when you're lost. Could be days, could be years. We don't really know anymore." I looked around at the other figures. They all had that same tired, confused expression, like people who'd been driving for hours and couldn't remember where they were supposed to be going. "This is Desert Wind Travel Plaza," I told them. "Interstate 40, mile marker 247, Arizona." "That's not where we stopped," said a woman wearing a 1960s style dress. "We stopped at Murphy's truck stop in Oklahoma. That was..." She paused, trying to remember. "That was last Tuesday, I think." "Ma'am, there's no Murphy's truck stop at this location. This facility has been Desert Wind Travel Plaza since 1987. The woman looked even more confused. "But we just stopped for coffee and directions. Harold was having trouble with the carburetor, so we pulled in to see if they had a mechanic." I realized I was talking to people who had no idea how much time had passed since they'd originally stopped at whatever facility had existed at this location before Desert Wind was built. They were stuck in some kind of temporal loop, repeating the same stop over and over again, without understanding that they were no longer in their own time period. "Listen," I said, "I work security here. Maybe I can help you figure out how to get where you're going." Frank smiled sadly. "You're a good man, Merle, but we've tried getting help before. Every few years, someone new starts working here, and they can see us for a while. They try to help, but eventually they either figure out how to stop seeing us or what? Or they join us, start their own journey that doesn't end where it's supposed to." At 5:18 a.m., I was back in the security office, reviewing everything that had happened and trying to figure out how to document it in a way that wouldn't get me fired or committed to a psychiatric facility. The monitors were back to showing normal facility operations. No figures in period clothing, no vintage vehicles, no signs or messages about finding roads home. Everything looked exactly as it should at 5 a.m. at a truck stop. Quiet, mostly empty, with just a few trucks parked for the night and the normal lighting systems operating properly. But I knew what I'd seen and heard. I had temperature readings that showed unexplained cold spots. I had radio recordings of voices from different time periods. I had my own memories of conversations with people who claimed to be lost travelers from decades past. The problem was, none of it would make sense to anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves. I spent the rest of my shift writing up incident reports and backing up all the recorded footage, even though the recordings didn't show the anomalies I'd witnessed in real time. I documented everything: the temperature variations, the radio interference, the camera malfunctions that weren't recorded as malfunctions. At 6 a.m., my replacement arrived for the day shift. Vernon Moss had been working security at truck stops for 15 years, and I thought maybe he'd believe what I was telling him about the overnight incidents. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Vernon said when he walked into the office. "Something like that," I told him. I explained about the camera malfunctions, the temperature anomalies, the figures I'd seen on the monitors but not in person. Vernon listened patiently, then said, "Merle, you've been working too many nights. This job will mess with your head if you let it. I've seen guys start imagining all kinds of things after a few months of overnight shifts. This wasn't imagination. I've got documentation." "Show me." I pulled up the recorded footage from the previous night, but everything looked completely normal. No figures, no anomalies, no evidence of anything unusual happening. The temperature readings on my thermometer had somehow reset to normal ranges. Even the radio recordings of the voices had been replaced by standard static. "Merle," Vernon said gently, "maybe you should take a few days off. Get some sleep during normal hours. Spend some time away from this place." But I knew I wasn't losing my mind. Something was happening at Desert Wind Travel Plaza that existed outside the normal boundaries of reality, and I was apparently one of the few people who could perceive it. Over the next few weeks, I started researching the history of mile marker 247 on Interstate 40. What I found explained everything and made me realize that my experience was part of a pattern that had been going on for decades. The Desert Wind Travel Plaza was built in 1987 on the site of Murphy's truck stop, which had operated from 1962 to 1985. Before Murphy's, there had been a series of different businesses at the same location: gas stations, cafes, and motor courts that served travelers on what was then U.S. Route 66. The location had a history of unexplained incidents going back to the 1940s. Travelers would stop for fuel or food and simply disappear, leaving their vehicles behind with no indication of where they'd gone. Staff members at various businesses reported seeing customers who seemed to be from different time periods, or who would vanish from one moment to the next. Most significantly, I found newspaper articles from the 1970s describing a phenomenon that locals had started calling the lost travelers. People driving Route 66 would report stopping at Murphy's truck stop for directions or assistance, only to be told by other travelers that Murphy's had been closed for years. When these confused travelers would drive to the next town and ask about Murphy's, they'd be told that it was definitely still operating and that they must have made a mistake. But when they tried to return to the location, they couldn't find it. It was like the business existed for some people, but not for others, or existed in some time periods but not in others. The pattern suggested that mile marker 247 was some kind of temporal crossroads, a place where travelers from different eras would become stuck or lost, unable to continue their journeys to their intended destinations. I started paying closer attention during my shifts and discovered that the phenomena followed predictable patterns. The manifestations were strongest during the overnight hours, particularly between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. They were more frequent during certain weather conditions. Clear, still nights with low humidity seemed to increase the activity. Most importantly, I learned that not everyone could see them. Some of my co-workers had never noticed anything unusual, even after working at the facility for years. Others had brief periods where they could perceive the lost travelers, but the ability would fade after a few weeks or months. I seemed to be one of the few people who could consistently see and interact with them. Over the following months, I had dozens of conversations with the lost travelers. I learned their stories, tried to help them understand what had happened to them, and attempted to find ways to assist them in completing their interrupted journeys. Frank, the man with the sign, had been driving a load from Detroit to Phoenix in 1967 when he stopped at Murphy's truck stop for fuel and directions. He'd been trying to find his way back to the interstate ever since, but every road he took led him back to the same location. The woman in the 1960s dress was named Betty, and she'd been traveling with her husband Harold from Oklahoma to California in 1963. They'd stopped at a gas station for car trouble and had been trying to continue their trip for what seemed like days but might have been decades. There were dozens of others, truckers from the 1970s and 80s, families on road trips from various decades, even a few individuals who seemed to be from the 1940s and 50s. All of them had stopped at businesses that had existed at mile marker 247 at different points in time, and all of them had become trapped in some kind of temporal loop that prevented them from reaching their destinations. The most disturbing aspect was that they were slowly losing their connection to their original time periods. The longer they remained stuck, the more their memories faded and the less they understood about where they'd come from or where they were trying to go. Some of the travelers I encountered had been there so long that they could barely remember their own names. They existed in a state of perpetual confusion, knowing they were supposed to be somewhere else but unable to recall where or why. I tried everything I could think of to help them. I researched their original routes and tried to give them updated directions to their destinations. I attempted to contact their families to let them know what had happened, though finding people from decades ago proved nearly impossible. I even tried to physically guide some of them away from the facility, walking with them toward the interstate on-ramps. But every time we'd reach what should have been the road leading away from Desert Wind, we'd somehow end up back in the parking lot, with the travelers more confused than before. It was like the location existed in a pocket outside of normal space-time, and once you became trapped there, the normal rules of geography and navigation no longer applied. The breaking point came 6 months into my employment at Desert Wind. I was working the night shift on April 15th, 2024, when I noticed something different about the lost travelers. Instead of their usual confused wandering, they were all moving in the same direction, toward the back of the facility where our maintenance buildings were located. I followed them and found them gathered around a section of the parking lot that I had never paid much attention to before. It was an area where the asphalt looked newer than the surrounding pavement, like it had been recently repaired or repaved. Frank was there, along with Betty and Harold and dozens of others. They were all staring at the ground with expressions I'd never seen on their faces before. Not confusion, but recognition. "This is where it happened," Frank said when he saw me approaching. "Where what happened?" "Where we first got lost. All of us. This is where the road changed." I looked at the section of pavement they were focused on. It looked completely normal to me. Just standard asphalt parking lot surface. "I don't understand." Betty stepped forward. "We remember now. We all stopped here on the same night, but at different times. Different years, different decades, but the same moment. That doesn't make sense." "Time isn't what you think it is," Harold said. "Sometimes all the moments happen at once, and travelers from different whens end up in the same where." As they spoke, I began to see something in the pavement. Not clearly at first, just a suggestion of depth, like looking into dark water. But gradually I could make out what appeared to be another layer beneath the asphalt. Older pavement from a different era. And beneath that, another layer. And another. I was looking at decades of road surface, all existing simultaneously in the same space. The original Route 66 pavement from the 1940s, layers of repairs and improvements from subsequent decades, and the current Interstate 40 surface all occupying the same physical location but in different temporal dimensions. Every time they rebuilt the road, Frank explained, some travelers got caught between the old path and the new one. We're the ones who couldn't find our way from where we were to where the road went. But why can I see you when others can't? Because you're starting to get lost, too, Betty said sadly. You've been here too long, seen too much. The boundaries are getting thin for you. I realized she was right. Over the past few months, I'd been having increasing difficulty remembering details about my life before working at Desert Wind. My apartment in Flagstaff felt less real than the conversations I had with the lost travelers. My relationships with friends and family were becoming distant and vague. I was losing my connection to my own time period and starting to drift into the same temporal limbo that had trapped the others. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't help the lost travelers find their way home, but I could avoid joining them. I submitted my resignation the next morning and left Arizona immediately. I didn't even go back to my apartment to pack. I just got in my car and drove east until I reached a place that felt solidly connected to the present moment. But leaving Desert Wind didn't end my connection to the lost travelers. Even now, 2 years later, I still see them occasionally. Not as clearly as I did during my time at the facility, but they're there in my peripheral vision, in reflections in windows, in the spaces between seconds when I'm not paying attention. They're still trying to find their way home, and they're still hoping that someone will be able to help them complete their interrupted journeys. I'm telling this story now because I want people to understand what's happening at certain locations along America's highway system. Places where the roads have been rebuilt multiple times, where the old routes and the new ones intersect in ways that create temporal anomalies. If you're ever driving through eastern Arizona on Interstate 40, and you stop at Desert Wind Travel Plaza at mile marker 247, pay attention to what you see and hear during the overnight hours. If you notice people in outdated clothing or vehicles that look like they're from different eras or temperature fluctuations that can't be explained by weather conditions, you're witnessing the lost travelers. Don't try to help them. Don't engage with them directly. And whatever you do, don't work there long enough to start seeing them clearly. Because once you become fully aware of their existence, once you start trying to help them find their way home, you risk getting lost yourself. The roads between then and now are treacherous, and not everyone who travels them reaches their intended destination. Some journeys, once begun, have no end. Some travelers, once lost, remain lost forever. And some places exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, collecting wanderers from across the decades who stopped for just a moment and found they couldn't leave. Desert Wind Travel Plaza is one of those places. The lost travelers are still there, still looking for the road home, still hoping that someone will understand their situation well enough to guide them back to their own time. But I've learned that some kinds of help come with a price, and some problems can't be solved without becoming part of them. The security cameras still record everything that happens at Desert Wind, but they only capture one layer of reality. The full truth exists in the spaces between the recordings, in the moments when time itself becomes unstable and travelers from different eras share the same location. If you ever find yourself working the night shift at a truck stop and you start seeing things that don't quite make sense, remember my story. Remember that some places are crossroads in more ways than one, and that getting lost doesn't always mean you've taken a wrong turn. Sometimes it means you've stepped outside of time itself. The lost travelers at Desert Wind are proof that our understanding of space and time is incomplete. They exist in the gaps between moments, in the spaces where past and present overlap, in the cracks that form when reality gets rebuilt too many times in the same location. And they're not the only ones. After leaving Desert Wind, I started researching similar incidents at other locations along the interstate highway system. What I found was disturbing and extensive. Reports of temporal anomalies at truck stops, rest areas, and gas stations across the country, particularly at sites where newer roads had been built over older routes. Route 66 locations seem to be especially prone to these phenomena, probably because that highway was rebuilt and rerouted so many times over its operational period. Every time they moved the road or upgraded the surface, some travelers got caught in the transition and never made it to the new route. But it's not limited to Route 66. I found similar reports along Interstate 10 in Texas, Interstate 80 in Nevada, Interstate 95 along the East Coast, and dozens of other locations where major highways intersect with older travel routes. The pattern is always the same. Businesses built on sites with long histories of serving travelers, overnight workers who start seeing people in outdated clothing, security systems that malfunction in specific ways, and temperature anomalies that can't be explained by conventional means. Most of the workers who experience these phenomena either quit quickly or convince themselves they're imagining things. But a few, like me, stick around long enough to understand what they're seeing and to make contact with the lost travelers, and some of those workers eventually join them. I found records of dozens of truck stop employees who had simply vanished from their jobs over the past few decades. They'd leave their posts during overnight shifts and never return, with no indication of where they'd gone or why they'd left. Their vehicles would be found in the employee parking areas, still locked, with personal belongings inside. Security cameras would show them walking away from their workstations, but never show them leaving the property. I believe these were people who tried to help the lost travelers and got pulled into the same temporal anomalies that had trapped their intended beneficiaries. The most disturbing case I found was at a truck stop in Oklahoma that had been built on the site of an old Route 66 cafe. Between 1995 and 2005, 7 different night shift workers had disappeared under identical circumstances. The facility had gone through multiple ownership changes, and each new management team would hire replacements without being told about the history of unexplained disappearances. The Oklahoma State Police had investigated each case, but found no evidence of foul play. The workers had simply walked away from their jobs in the middle of their shifts and vanished without a trace. When I contacted the current management of that facility, they told me they no longer operate with overnight staff. The building is locked from midnight to 6 a.m. with only automated fuel pumps available during those hours. Too many problems with the night shift, the manager told me. Weird stuff that we couldn't explain. It was easier to just close during the overnight hours. Similar closures have occurred at truck stops across the country, always at locations with histories of unexplained incidents during the overnight hours. The businesses remain profitable during daylight hours, but something about the combination of darkness and isolation creates conditions that allow the temporal anomalies to manifest. I tried to warn the corporate headquarters of Desert Wind Travel Plaza about what I'd experienced, but my reports were filed away and never acted upon. They classified my accounts as stress-related hallucinations and implemented a policy requiring all security personnel to undergo psychological evaluations every 6 months. They've had 12 different night shift security supervisors since I left in 2024. The average tenure is about 3 months before workers quit or request transfers to day shifts. But the facility remains open 24 hours, and the lost travelers are still there, still trying to find their way home. I know because I go back sometimes, not to work and not to try to help the stranded travelers, but to maintain my connection to that liminal space where time operates according to different rules. Because once you've seen past the boundaries of normal reality, it's difficult to exist entirely within those boundaries again. Every few months, I drive out to mile marker 247 and spend a night in the parking lot, watching the security cameras cycle through their feeds and observing the layers of reality that exist simultaneously at that location. The lost travelers recognize me when I return. Frank always waves from his position near the shower facilities. Betty and Harold smile sadly from their eternal search for the road to California. The dozens of other stranded souls acknowledge my presence with nods and gestures that suggest they remember our conversations. But I don't get out of my car anymore. I don't engage with them directly or try to help them understand their situation. I've learned that maintaining some distance is the only way to avoid getting pulled into their temporal prison. During my most recent visit, in September 2024, I noticed something new. There were fresh faces among the lost travelers. People wearing more contemporary clothing, driving vehicles from the 1990s and early 2000s. The phenomenon is still active. People are still getting trapped at mile marker 247, still becoming lost between one moment and the next, still joining the population of travelers who can't find their way home. Among the new arrivals, I recognize someone who made my blood run cold. It was Vernon Moss, my replacement as head of security at Desert Wind. He was wearing the same uniform I remembered from my last day at the facility, and he had the same confused expression that all the lost travelers develop when they first realize they're trapped. Vernon saw me sitting in my car and walked over to the window. When I rolled it down, he looked at me with a mixture of recognition and desperation. "Merle," he said, "I think I'm in trouble. I can't find my way home." "How long have you been here, Vernon?" He looked confused by the question, just like Frank had when I'd asked him the same thing. "I don't know. I was working the night shift and there was some kind of problem with the security cameras. I went outside to investigate, and when I tried to go back inside, the building was locked." "When did this happen?" "Last night, I think. Or maybe the night before. Time seems different here." According to the calendar on my phone, Vernon had been reported missing from his post 6 weeks earlier. The corporate office had assumed he'd simply quit without notice, and they'd hired another replacement. But Vernon was experiencing his disappearance as a recent event, even though weeks had passed in normal time. This confirmed what I'd suspected about the temporal effects of the location. Time moves differently for the lost travelers, and their perception of duration doesn't match external reality. "Vernon, listen to me carefully. You're stuck in some kind of time anomaly. You need to stop trying to get back inside the building and start looking for a way to leave this location entirely." "I don't understand. This is where I work. I can't just leave." "You don't work here anymore, Vernon. You've been missing for 6 weeks." He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. The same expression I'd seen on dozens of other lost travelers when I tried to explain their situation. "That's not possible. I just started my shift a few hours ago." I realized that trying to help Vernon understand his predicament would only draw me deeper into the same temporal anomaly that had trapped him. The lost travelers couldn't comprehend their situation because accepting the truth would require them to acknowledge that they existed outside of normal time, and that level of understanding seemed to accelerate their disconnection from reality. "I'm sorry, Vernon," I told him. "I can't help you." I rolled up my window and drove away, leaving him standing in the parking lot with the same confused expression that all the lost travelers wore when they first realized something was wrong. But I could see him in my rearview mirror for much longer than should have been possible, standing under the sodium lights of Desert Wind Travel Plaza, becoming part of the permanent population of stranded souls who would spend eternity trying to complete journeys that had no end. That was my last visit to mile marker 247. I realized that even observing the phenomena from a distance was creating a connection that could eventually pull me back into that temporal prison. Instead, I've focused on documenting what I experienced and researching similar incidents at other locations. I want to create a record that might help future truck stop workers recognize the warning signs and avoid getting trapped like Vernon and the others. The signs are always the same: security cameras that show different versions of reality in real time versus recorded footage. temperature anomalies in specific areas that can't be explained by weather or mechanical systems, radio and communication equipment that picks up voices from different time periods, customers or visitors who seem to be from different eras, wearing outdated clothing or driving vintage vehicles, people who appear on security monitors but aren't visible to direct observation, or vice versa. And most importantly, the feeling that time itself is unstable at the location, that moments are stretching or compressing in ways that don't follow natural patterns. If you experience any of these phenomena while working at a truck stop, especially during overnight hours, document everything you can and leave immediately. Don't try to investigate further. Don't attempt to help any lost travelers you might encounter, and don't convince yourself that you're imagining things. The temporal anomalies are real, and they're dangerous in ways that our current understanding of physics can't explain. I've also learned that certain individuals are more susceptible to perceiving these phenomena than others. People with backgrounds in law enforcement or security work seem to be particularly vulnerable, possibly because our training makes us more observant of details that don't fit normal patterns. Night shift workers are at higher risk than day shift employees, probably because the anomalies are stronger during the overnight hours when normal activity levels are lower. And people who work alone are more likely to experience the phenomena than those who work in groups, suggesting that isolation is a factor in creating the conditions necessary for temporal perception. If you fit any of these categories and you're considering employment at a truck stop or similar facility, research the history of the location first. Look for patterns of high employee turnover during night shifts, reports of unexplained incidents, or local legends about strange occurrences. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about a location, if you start seeing things that don't make sense, if you feel like you're losing your connection to normal time and space, leave immediately. No job is worth becoming trapped in a temporal anomaly that could last for decades or centuries. The lost travelers at Desert Wind and similar locations are proof that some kinds of wrong turns can't be corrected. Some kinds of getting lost have no solution, and some journeys, once begun, continue forever whether the traveler wants them to or not. I was lucky. I recognized the danger in time to escape before becoming permanently trapped. But dozens of others haven't been so fortunate, and their numbers continue to grow as more people encounter these temporal crossroads without understanding what they're experiencing. The American highway system is built on top of centuries of older travel routes, and some of those ancient paths still exert influence on modern travelers. When you're driving the interstates late at night, especially through areas where multiple highways intersect or where newer roads have been built over much older routes, remember that you're traveling through layers of history that don't always remain properly separated. Most of the time, the past stays in the past, and the present remains firmly anchored in the present. But sometimes, usually in the dark hours when the world feels most isolated and mysterious, those boundaries break down. When that happens, travelers from different eras can find themselves sharing the same space, and some of them never find their way back to their own time. If you ever stop at a truck stop or rest area and notice people who seem to be from different decades, or if you see vehicles that look like they belong in a museum, or if you hear voices speaking in accents and using expressions from bygone eras, pay attention to what your instincts tell you. You might be witnessing the lost travelers, still trying to complete journeys that began decades ago and never ended where they were supposed to. And if you are witnessing them, be very careful about how you respond, because some kinds of help lead to becoming part of the problem, and some attempts to provide assistance result in joining the people you're trying to aid. The road between here and there is more complex than our maps suggest, and not every journey has a destination that exists in normal space and time. Some travelers have been driving toward home for 50 years or more, making the same stops, asking for the same directions, trying to navigate routes that no longer exist in the reality they started from. They're still out there, at truck stops and rest areas across the country, hoping that someone will understand their situation well enough to help them find their way. But the help they need might not be something that anyone in our time period can provide, because some roads, once lost, can never be found again. And some travelers, once they step outside of normal time, discover that the path back home leads through territories that don't appear on any map and can't be reached by following conventional directions. The security footage from Desert Wind Travel Plaza contains layers of information that our current technology can't properly decode. The cameras record multiple versions of reality simultaneously, but our viewing equipment can only display one layer at a time. If someone ever develops the technology to properly analyze those recordings, they'll find documentation of decades of lost travelers, all sharing the same space but existing in different temporal dimensions. They'll see families from the 1960s still trying to reach California, truckers from the 1970s still hauling loads that will never be delivered, and individuals from various eras all united by their inability to complete journeys that should have ended long ago. And they'll see me, walking among them during those months when I could perceive their reality, trying to help them understand their situation and find their way home. What they won't see is any record of success, because despite all my efforts, despite all the conversations and attempts at assistance, I never managed to help a single lost traveler escape from their temporal prison. The best I could do was avoid joining them myself. That might not seem like much of an accomplishment, but given how many others have become permanently trapped at similar locations, I consider it a significant victory. I'm sharing this account because I want people to understand that America's highway system contains dangers that aren't mentioned in any travel guides or safety manuals. There are places where the normal rules of space and time don't apply consistently, where travelers can become lost in ways that GPS navigation systems can't fix. If you're ever driving long distances, especially during overnight hours, and you stop at a facility that feels somehow wrong or unstable, trust your instincts and leave as quickly as possible. Don't investigate unusual phenomena. Don't try to help confused travelers who seem to be from different time periods. And don't assume that strange experiences are just products of fatigue or imagination. Some kinds of getting lost are permanent, and some places serve as traps for unwary travelers who step outside of normal reality without understanding the dangers they're facing. The lost travelers at Desert Wind Travel Plaza are still there, still hoping that someone will help them find the road home. But I've learned that some roads can only be traveled alone, and that some journeys have to be completed by the people who started them, regardless of how long it takes or how many decades pass in the outside world. The security cameras continue to record their endless search, layering decades of footage into a single digital archive that captures the persistence of hope in the face of impossible circumstances. And somewhere in those recordings, future researchers might find clues about the nature of time itself, and about what happens to travelers who lose their way between one moment and the next. Until then, the lost travelers wait and watch and hope that someone will understand their situation well enough to guide them back to the reality they started from. But understanding might not be enough, and some problems might not have solutions that exist within the boundaries of normal space and time. Some journeys, once begun, continue forever. Some roads, once lost, can never be found again, and some travelers discover that the only way home leads through territories that don't exist on any map, toward destinations that can only be reached by those who are willing to step outside of time itself. The security footage continues recording, documenting everything and explaining nothing, storing layers of reality that our technology can access but not decode. And the lost travelers continue their eternal search, hoping that someone, someday, will develop the understanding necessary to help them complete journeys that began in one era and have continued through all the eras since. But that day has not yet come, and until it does, they remain trapped between here and there, between then and now, between the roads they remember and the highways that replaced them, forever traveling, forever searching, forever hoping for a way home that might not exist in any reality accessible to those of us who remain anchored in normal time. The Desert Wind Travel Plaza operates 24 hours a day, serving thousands of travelers each month who pass through without ever seeing the lost souls who share their location. But the security cameras see everything, record everything, and preserve everything for future analysis by people who might understand what the rest of us can only witness and document. In the meantime, the night shifts continue, the cameras keep recording, and new workers occasionally discover that they can see more than they expected when they took jobs that seemed routine and safe. Some of those workers learn to ignore what they're seeing. Others find excuses to transfer to day shifts or quit entirely. And a few, like Vernon Moss, investigate too thoroughly and find themselves joining the population of travelers who can't find their way home. The cycle continues, the recordings accumulate, and the lost travelers maintain their hope that someone, eventually, will understand their situation well enough to help them escape from the temporal prison that holds them. But until that day comes, they remain trapped at mile marker 247, sharing space with travelers from our era who pass through without knowing they're walking among people from decades past who stopped for a moment and never left. The security footage documents everything, but understanding requires more than just observation. It requires accepting that reality is more complex than we assumed, that time is less stable than we believed, and that some kinds of getting lost can't be fixed by conventional navigation. The lost travelers learned these lessons too late to save themselves. But their experiences, documented in layers of security recordings and witness accounts like mine, might help future travelers avoid the same fate. If people are willing to believe that some truck stops serve as crossroads between different time periods, and that some journeys, once interrupted, continue forever in the spaces between moments. They hired me to keep the showers clean at Thunder Ridge Travel Center, but what I found in those rooms was a lot more than soap scum and forgotten towels. My name is Iris Velma Pritchard, and I worked the evening shift maintaining the shower facilities at Thunder Ridge from June 2021 to February 2022. 8 months that changed everything I thought I knew about what people leave behind when they think nobody's watching. Thunder Ridge sits at the junction of Interstate 70 and Highway 191 in eastern Utah, about 60 miles west of the Colorado border. It's built into the side of a mesa, with the main building carved right into the red sandstone cliff face. The shower block is separate from the main structure, connected by a covered walkway that always seemed to echo with footsteps even when nobody was walking on it. The facility serves long-haul truckers crossing the Rockies, tourists heading to the national parks, and locals who need fuel or supplies. During peak season, we'd process 300 to 400 showers per day. During the winter months when tourism dies down and trucking slows, maybe 50-60. But those quiet periods were when I started noticing things that didn't add up. I was 34 when I took the job, recently divorced and looking for work that didn't require much interaction with people. Cleaning seemed perfect, straightforward, measurable, something I could do well without having to make conversation or pretend to be happy when I wasn't. The pay was decent, the benefits were basic but adequate, and the manager, Rusty Caldwell, seemed like a fair man who wouldn't hassle me as long as I did my work properly. The shower block has 24 individual rooms, each with a private bathroom, shower stall, and small changing area. They're numbered 1 through 24, arranged in 2 rows facing each other across a central hallway. The evening shift runs from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., covering the busiest period when drivers are finishing their daily routes and settling in for mandatory rest periods. My job was simple: clean each room after use, restock supplies, report maintenance issues, and keep detailed logs of room usage and cleaning times. The company required precise documentation for insurance and health department purposes, so I had to record when each room was used, how long customers stayed, what condition they left the room in, and what cleaning supplies I used. That documentation is what saved my sanity later, when I started questioning whether what I was experiencing was real or just stress-induced hallucinations. For the first month, everything was routine. Truckers would check in at the main desk, get assigned a room number and access code, use the facilities for 30-45 minutes, and check out. I'd clean up after them, usually just basic tidying, fresh towels, mopping the floor, restocking soap and shampoo. Most drivers were respectful of the facilities and didn't leave much mess. The rooms were equipped with digital locks that recorded entry and exit times, so I always knew exactly when someone had been in a room and for how long. The system was connected to the main computer at the front desk, and it generated automated reports that tracked usage patterns and helped with scheduling. It was during my second month that I started noticing discrepancies in the digital records. Room 17 was the first one that didn't make sense. According to the computer logs, a customer had checked in at 4:23 p.m. on a Tuesday in July and stayed for 47 minutes. Standard usage time. But when I went to clean the room at 5:15 p.m., after the customer had supposedly checked out, the room looked like nobody had used it at all. The towels were still folded exactly as I'd left them. The soap dispensers hadn't been touched. The shower stall was completely dry, and there was no condensation on the mirror or walls that would indicate someone had used hot water. Even the floor was dry, with no footprints or water spots. I checked the computer logs again. The system clearly showed that someone with a valid access code had entered the room at 4:23 p.m. and exited at 5:10 p.m. But there was no physical evidence that anyone had been there. I mentioned it to Rusty during my next shift. He said sometimes customers change their minds and don't actually use the facilities, or they might use the room just to rest without showering. As long as they pay for the time, we don't care what they do in there, he told me. That made sense, but it didn't explain why there were no signs of occupancy at all. No shoe prints, no fingerprints on surfaces, no indication that anyone had even walked into the room. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to the usage logs and comparing them to the actual condition of the rooms. About once or twice a week, I'd find rooms that showed computer usage but no physical evidence of occupancy. Always different rooms, always different times, always the same pattern, valid access codes, reasonable stay durations, but rooms that looked untouched. Then I started finding rooms that showed the opposite pattern. Room 12 was the first one that really scared me. According to the computer, nobody had used it that day. The last recorded access was from the previous evening. But when I opened the door for routine cleaning, the room was a mess. Water everywhere, like someone had deliberately flooded the shower stall and let it overflow onto the floor. Towels soaked and scattered around the room. Soap dispensers empty despite being full when I'd restocked them that morning. The mirror was completely fogged over, and the walls were dripping with condensation like someone had run the hot water for hours. I checked the computer logs 3 times. No record of anyone entering that room since 7:30 p.m. the previous day. But someone had definitely been there, and recently, the water was still warm and the condensation was fresh. I reported it to Rusty as a possible break-in or computer malfunction. He came down to look at the room, but by the time he arrived, everything was normal. The water had drained away, the towels were where they should be, and there was no condensation on any surfaces. "You sure about this, Iris?" he asked, looking around the perfectly normal room. I was sure, but I couldn't prove it. And I was starting to wonder if the stress of my recent divorce and job change was making me see things that weren't there. The incidents continued throughout the summer, gradually becoming more frequent and more difficult to dismiss as equipment malfunctions or my imagination. Rooms that showed usage but no evidence of occupancy, Rooms that showed no usage but clear evidence that someone had been there. Temperature fluctuations that didn't match the thermostat settings. Sounds coming from rooms that the computer showed as empty. I started keeping my own records, separate from the official logs. Every discrepancy, every unusual condition, every sound or smell or temperature change that didn't fit the normal patterns. By August, I had documented over 40 incidents that couldn't be explained by equipment problems or user behavior. The breakthrough came in September when I decided to hide in the supply closet and watch room 17 during a period when the computer showed it was occupied, but I suspected it was actually empty. At 6:47 p.m., the access log showed someone entering room 17. I waited 5 minutes, then quietly opened the supply closet door and looked down the hallway. The indicator light on room 17 showed it was occupied, just like the computer said. But I could see under the door. There was no light on inside the room, and there were no shadows moving around that would indicate someone was in there. I waited for the full 45 minutes that the computer showed the room was in use. During that time, I never heard any sounds from room 17. No water running, no footsteps, no movement at all. At 7:32 p.m., the access log showed the customer checking out, and the indicator light switched to vacant. I gave it another 5 minutes, then went to clean the room. It was exactly as I'd left it. Towels folded, surfaces dry, no signs of use. But here's what really scared me. When I touched the door handle, it was ice cold. Not just cool, but cold enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled near it. The hallway temperature was normal, but the door to room 17 was so cold it felt like touching a freezer. I opened the door, and the temperature inside the room was at least 20 degrees lower than the hallway. I could see my breath clearly, and there was frost forming on the mirror and metal fixtures. I backed out of the room and closed the door. When I checked it again 10 minutes later, the temperature was back to normal. That's when I realized that the discrepancies in the usage logs weren't caused by computer malfunctions or customer behavior. Something else was using the shower rooms. Something that could trigger the digital access system but didn't leave the same kind of physical evidence that human occupants would. I started researching the history of Thunder Ridge Travel Center and the land it was built on. What I found explained everything and made me realize I was dealing with something much older and more complex than equipment malfunctions. The travel center was built in 1987 on the site of a natural spring that had been used by Native American travelers for centuries. The spring was considered sacred by several tribes, particularly the Ute people who believed it had healing properties and served as a resting place for spirits traveling between worlds. When the railroad came through in the 1880s, a small station was built near the spring to provide water for steam engines. The station included basic facilities for passengers, a waiting room, ticket office, and washroom where travelers could clean up during long journeys. But the station had a troubled history. Between 1885 and 1923, over 30 passengers and railroad workers died at the site under mysterious circumstances. Some were listed as accidents, others as unexplained illnesses, and a few as suicides. But the pattern was disturbing enough that the railroad eventually closed the station and rerouted trains to avoid the area. Local newspapers from that period included several accounts of strange incidents at the station. Passengers reported seeing other travelers in the washroom who would vanish when approached directly. Railroad workers described voices and sounds coming from empty facilities. Some people claimed they encountered individuals in outdated clothing who seemed confused about what year it was or where they were trying to go. The most detailed account was published in the Grand Junction Gazette in 1919. Mr. Benjamin Hawthorne of Denver reports a most unusual encounter while traveling westbound on the Denver and Rio Grande line. During a scheduled stop at Thunder Ridge Station, Mr. Hawthorne entered the passenger washroom and observed a woman in Victorian dress using the facilities. When he inquired if she required assistance, she looked at him with great confusion and asked what year it was. Upon being informed it was 1919, The woman became greatly distressed and insisted it should be 1894. Mr. Hawthorne left the washroom to summon the station master, but when they returned, the woman had vanished. No female passengers were aboard the train that day. Similar stories appeared regularly in local papers throughout the station's operational period, always involving the washroom facilities, always featuring people who seemed to be from different time periods, always ending with the mysterious individuals disappearing before their identities could be established. After the railroad closed the station in 1923, the site remained abandoned for decades. The buildings gradually deteriorated, but the spring continued to flow, and locals reported occasional strange sightings in the area. Hikers and hunters would sometimes encounter people in outdated clothing near the old station ruins, but these individuals would never respond to attempts at conversation and would vanish if approached too closely. When Thunder Ridge Travel Center was built in 1987, the construction crews reported several unusual incidents. Tools would go missing and reappear in different locations. Workers would hear voices and footsteps in areas that were supposed to be empty. The plumbing in the shower block required multiple attempts to install properly because water would flow in directions that defied gravity, and temperature controls would malfunction in ways that made no engineering sense. The most significant discovery came when crews were excavating the foundation for the shower block. They found the remains of the original railroad station washroom, with plumbing and fixtures that were still intact after 60 years of abandonment. The construction supervisor wanted to preserve the historical artifacts, but the developer insisted on removing everything to make way for the new facilities. According to several workers I interviewed, strange things started happening immediately after the old washroom was demolished. Equipment would malfunction for no apparent reason. Workers would report seeing people in period clothing in areas where no one should have been. The temperature in the construction area would fluctuate wildly, sometimes dropping by 30 degrees in a matter of minutes. The general contractor eventually hired a spiritual advisor from the local Ute community to perform a blessing ceremony before construction could continue. The ceremony seemed to help. The equipment problem stopped, and workers no longer reported unusual sightings. But the spiritual advisor, a woman named Sarah Running Bear, told the contractor that the blessing would only contain the spirits, not remove them. "They're still here," she said, "but now they understand that this is a different time and they need to coexist with the new travelers." That conversation was recorded in the construction logs, which I was able to access through the county building department. Sarah Running Bear had warned that the spirits would continue to use the facilities, but in ways that wouldn't interfere with modern operations. They would appear during quiet periods, use the spaces for their intended purpose, and then return to whatever realm they normally inhabited. Her words proved prophetic. For the first 34 years of operation, Thunder Ridge Travel Center had occasional reports of unusual incidents in the shower facilities, but nothing that seriously disrupted business. Customers would sometimes mention seeing other people in the hallway who didn't seem quite right, or hearing voices from rooms that were supposed to be empty. But these reports were infrequent and easily dismissed. What changed in 2021, according to the maintenance logs I reviewed, was the installation of a new digital access control system. The old mechanical locks were replaced with electronic systems that could track usage times and generate detailed reports for management. I believe the new technology created an interface between the modern facility and the spiritual realm where the displaced travelers existed. The electronic locks could detect their presence and record their usage of the facilities. But the spirits weren't bound by the same physical laws that living customers followed. They could enter rooms without triggering motion sensors, use facilities without consuming supplies, and leave without creating the normal evidence of occupancy. But their presence was real enough to affect temperature, air pressure, and electromagnetic fields in ways that sensitive equipment could detect. By October, I had developed a routine for dealing with the anomalous room usage. When I found rooms that showed computer access but no physical evidence of use, I would clean them normally but note the discrepancy in my personal logs. When I found rooms that showed no computer access but clear evidence of use, I would clean them thoroughly and reset the environmental controls to remove any temperature anomalies. I also started leaving small offerings in rooms that seemed to have high spiritual activity. Bottles of water, travel-sized soaps, clean towels. Not because the spirits needed these items, but because I felt they deserved the same hospitality we provided to living customers. The offerings were always gone the next day, though the computer logs never showed anyone entering those rooms. The incidents that made me finally understand what I was dealing with happened in November, during the slow season when tourist traffic drops off and we might only process 20 to 30 showers per day. I was working the evening shift on November 15th when I heard voices coming from the shower block. Multiple people talking, but quiet enough that I couldn't make out words. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes customers would talk on their phones while showering, or drivers traveling together would carry on conversations between rooms. But when I checked the computer logs, only one room was showing as occupied, room 8, which had been in use for about 20 minutes. All the other rooms showed as vacant and available. I walked down the hallway to investigate, and I could clearly hear the voices coming from room 15. Not just one person on a phone, but what sounded like a conversation between multiple people. I could hear both male and female voices, speaking in what sounded like formal, old-fashioned speech patterns. I knocked on the door of room 15. "Excuse me, is everything all right in there?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence from inside the room. I checked the computer logs again. Room 15 was showing as vacant, with no access recorded since the previous day. But I'd clearly heard multiple people talking inside. I used my master key to open the door. The room was empty, but it was filled with steam like someone had just finished a hot shower. The mirror was completely fogged over, and I could feel the humidity in the air. But all the towels were still folded and dry, and the shower stall showed no signs of recent use. What really got my attention was the smell. Not the usual shower smells of soap and shampoo, but something else. Something floral and old-fashioned, like perfume from a different era. And underneath that, the smell of coal smoke and steel, like the inside of an old train car. I documented everything. The temperature, 12 degrees above normal. The humidity level, 85% compared to the usual 45%. The sounds I'd heard, and the unusual smells. I also took photos with my phone, though they just showed an empty room with fogged mirrors. The next night, it happened again. Different room, different voices, same pattern. Conversations that stopped when I approached. Empty rooms filled with steam and period-appropriate smells. Computer logs that showed no usage. By the end of November, I was having these encounters almost every night. The spirits were becoming more active, more confident about using the facilities during my shift. Sometimes I would hear entire conversations, people discussing train schedules from the 1890s, families planning travel to destinations that no longer existed, individuals asking for directions to towns that had been abandoned decades ago. The most detailed conversation I overheard was on December 3rd. A woman was talking to what sounded like a station attendant about purchasing tickets to Denver. She was concerned about missing her connection and asked repeatedly about the departure time. The attendant assured her that the westbound train was running on schedule and would arrive at 4:30 p.m. I listened to this conversation for almost 10 minutes, standing outside room 22 where the voices were coming from. When I checked the computer logs, the room showed as vacant all day. But here's what made the conversation particularly significant. I had researched the old train schedules, and there had indeed been a westbound train that arrived at Thunder Ridge Station at 4:30 p.m. every day. That schedule had been in effect from 1892 to 1919. The spirits weren't just using the shower facilities. They were recreating conversations and interactions from the original railroad station, maintaining their routines from over a century ago. I started keeping detailed notes about what I heard, trying to piece together the stories of the individual spirits and understand what they were trying to accomplish. Over the winter months, I identified at least a dozen regular voices that appeared in my logs multiple times. There was Margaret, a woman traveling alone who was always worried about missing her train to San Francisco. She seemed to be from the 1890s, based on her speech patterns and the destinations she mentioned. There was Thomas, a railroad worker who was concerned about mechanical problems with locomotive engines. He would discuss repair schedules and parts orders in conversations with other workers who were never visible, but whose voices I could sometimes hear responding. There was the Miller family, a man, woman, and 2 children who were traveling to Colorado to start a new life on a homestead. They would discuss their plans and worries about the journey ahead, always mentioning that they were running late and hoped the train would wait for them. Each spirit seemed to be stuck in a loop, repeating the same concerns and conversations they'd had during their original visit to Thunder Ridge Station. They were using the shower facilities as washrooms, just as travelers had done when the railroad station was operational, but they were also reliving the moments that had brought them to the site originally. The most heartbreaking was a young man named David who had been killed in a railroad accident in 1903. He would appear in the shower rooms and ask repeatedly if anyone had seen his luggage, which had been lost in the wreck. He was always polite and grateful when I would assure him that his belongings were safe, but he would ask the same questions again the next time I encountered him. By January 2022, I had developed a routine for interacting with the spirits. When I heard voices from supposedly empty rooms, I would announce my presence and ask if they needed anything. Most of the time, they would go quiet, but occasionally they would respond with requests that made sense in the context of 1890s railroad travel. Margaret once asked if the dining car would be serving dinner. Thomas asked if there were any telegrams waiting for him. The Miller family wanted to know if their connecting train to Durango would be delayed by weather. I would respond as helpfully as I could, providing reassurance and information based on what I'd learned about historical railroad operations. I couldn't solve their fundamental problem. They were trapped in time loops that prevented them from continuing their journeys, but I could offer them the courtesy and respect they deserved as travelers who had simply gotten lost between one era and another. The spirits seemed to appreciate these interactions. Rooms they used would be left in perfect condition, with no cleanup required on my part. They never damaged anything or created problems that would affect living customers. They simply wanted to continue their routines in a space that served the same function as the facilities they remembered from their own time. The final incident that convinced me to leave my job happened in February 2022, on a night when a severe snowstorm had closed the interstate and left Thunder Ridge Travel Center nearly empty. I was doing my evening cleaning routine when I heard more voices than usual coming from the shower block. Not just the individual conversations I'd grown accustomed to, but what sounded like a crowd of people all talking at once. When I entered the shower hallway, I could see steam coming from under the doors of at least 6 different rooms. All of them showed as vacant in the computer system, but clearly there was significant spiritual activity happening. I walked down the hallway, listening to the conversations. They were more animated than usual, with people discussing travel plans and expressing concerns about delays and connections. But there was also something different. They were talking about current events, using references that suggested they were becoming aware of the modern world. From room 7, I heard Margaret asking about flying machines and whether they were safer than trains. From room 12, Thomas was discussing horseless carriages and wondering if they would replace locomotives. From room 18, the Miller family was asking about something called the Internet and whether it could help them find their destination. The spirits were evolving, adapting to the modern world around them, learning about changes that had occurred since their original time period. But they were also becoming more confused and agitated as they tried to reconcile their 19th century expectations with 21st century reality. I decided to try direct communication. I walked to room 7, where Margaret's voice was coming from, and knocked on the door. "Margaret?" I called out. "It's Iris. Can I help you with something?" The conversation inside stopped for a moment, then Margaret's voice responded. "Oh, Iris, dear, I'm so confused. People are telling me about flying machines that can cross the country in a few hours. Is that really possible?" "Yes, Margaret. We call them airplanes now. They're very common. But what happened to the trains? And why is everything so different? This washroom looks nothing like what I remember." I realized that Margaret and the other spirits were becoming fully conscious of the time displacement that had trapped them. They were no longer just reliving their original routines. They were actively trying to understand what had happened to them and how much time had passed. "Margaret, you've been here for a very long time, more than 100 years. The world has changed a lot since you were traveling." There was a long silence from inside the room. Then Margaret started crying, deep, heartbroken sobs that echoed through the empty hallway. "I just wanted to get to San Francisco," she said through her tears. "I was going to meet my sister. She was going to help me start a new life." "I know, Margaret. I'm sorry you got lost along the way." Is my sister still alive?" I didn't know how to answer that question. Margaret's sister would have died decades ago, along with everyone else from Margaret's original time period. But telling her that seemed unnecessarily cruel. "I don't know, Margaret, but I'm sure she would want you to find peace and happiness, wherever you are now." The crying gradually stopped, and Margaret's voice became very quiet. "I'm so tired of waiting for trains that never come. I'm so tired of being lost." That conversation broke my heart and made me realize that my presence was causing the spirits to become more aware of their situation, which was causing them pain. By interacting with them, by acknowledging their existence, I was forcing them to confront the reality of their displacement instead of allowing them to remain in the comfortable routines that had sustained them for over a century. I submitted my resignation the next day. But before I left, I did one final thing for the spirits. I researched the historical records and found information about Margaret's sister in San Francisco, Thomas's family in Denver, and the homestead that the Miller family had been trying to reach. I typed up detailed letters with this information and left them in the rooms where I'd most often encountered each spirit. I also left a general letter explaining that the world had moved on, that they were no longer bound by the routines of railroad travel, and that they had permission to continue their journeys in whatever way felt right to them. I don't know if the letters helped. I don't know if the spirits were able to find peace or if they're still using the shower facilities at Thunder Ridge Travel Center. I never went back to find out. But I hope that by acknowledging their stories and treating them with the respect they deserved as travelers who had simply taken a wrong turn between one century and another, I was able to provide some small comfort during their long wait for trains that would never arrive. My replacement was hired a week after I left. According to friends who still work at Thunder Ridge, he lasted exactly 3 days before quitting without explanation. They've had trouble keeping shower attendants ever since. The position has been filled 8 times in the past 2 years, with an average tenure of about 6 weeks. Management has started offering higher wages and better benefits, but they can't seem to find anyone willing to work the evening shift on a permanent basis. I think the spirits are still there, still using the facilities, still hoping that someone will help them understand what happened to their journeys and how they can continue toward their destinations. But understanding their situation requires accepting that some travelers get lost between one time and another, and that some journeys continue long after the original transportation systems have been replaced by newer technologies. The shower records I compiled during my 8 months at Thunder Ridge document over 200 incidents of anomalous room usage, temperature fluctuations that couldn't be explained by equipment problems, sounds and conversations from empty rooms, computer access logs that didn't match physical evidence of occupancy. Most significantly, the records document conversations with individual spirits who had distinct personalities, consistent stories, and specific concerns related to their original travel plans from the 1890s and early 1900s. These weren't random supernatural phenomena or equipment malfunctions. They were encounters with real people who had gotten lost between their own time and ours, and who were trying to complete journeys that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. I'm sharing this account because I believe the spirits at Thunder Ridge deserve to have their stories told. They were travelers, just like the customers who use the facility today. They stopped for basic services, washing, resting, planning the next leg of their journeys, and somehow became trapped in a location that existed between the world they knew and the world that replaced it. If you're ever driving through eastern Utah on Interstate 70, and you stop at Thunder Ridge Travel Center to use the shower facilities, listen carefully to the sounds around you. If you hear voices from rooms that should be empty, or if you encounter people who seem to be from a different era, remember that they're fellow travelers who need the same courtesy and respect that you would want if you were lost and confused in an unfamiliar place. Don't try to help them understand their situation. That knowledge causes them pain. Don't try to convince them that their trains aren't coming. That hope is what sustains them. Just acknowledge their presence, treat them with kindness, and allow them to continue their routines in peace. They've been waiting for over a century for transportation to destinations that no longer exist in the modern world. But they're still travelers, still hoping to complete journeys that matter to them, still deserving of the basic hospitality that we owe to anyone who stops at our facilities seeking rest and assistance. The shower records document their stories, preserve their voices, and serve as proof that some journeys transcend the boundaries of normal time and space. And maybe, someday, someone will figure out how to help them reach the destinations they've been seeking for so long.